Are we ready, Glenn?
I'm ready.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. Can you hear me in the back of the room? We decided to use our microphone this time because it's not good. So, welcome to the third workshop for the Clean Energy Transformation Act. We're so excited to have you all here today. A lot of thought and care has gone into planning today, and so we hope that you walk out of here feeling like you got something done today. So, quick question: how many folks have been here for this is the third one, all three? Woo! Yay! Thank you so much for sticking with us. We really, really appreciate it. And for those of you who haven't been here yet, we do kind of mix it up in the room a little bit. So hopefully you're okay with that. Things that you need. If you have things that you don't want to lug around with you, feel free to use the tables that are scattered throughout the room. A couple of safety. Oh, by the way, my name is Rebecca Stillings, and I am one of your co-facilitators today. My partner in facilitation is.
I'm Rachel Ravisky. We've met before. This is your third CETA meeting.
And we also have back on Skype Paul, and we have Brittany, who is just working the room, and we have a number of other folks here from Commerce that will be supporting you throughout the day as we maneuver through this workshop. So if you have any questions, Brittany, can you wave? Brittany is our go-to person, so she can help you. Bathrooms are out the door to the left. In the event of an emergency, go out that door, go out, go up the street, across the tracks, and we'll make sure that you're accounted for. So with that, anything else you want? Oh, the microphones up here and here and here are really, really sensitive. So if you think you're having a really private conversation with the person next to you, we won't be able to hear you, but the folks on Skype, welcome, by the way, will be able to hear you. So just keep that in mind as we move through the day. Are we recording this, Paul?
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically, we are recording this, so we do need to let you know that. And I would imagine that we will post it on the website in the event that it's so riveting you want to go back and listen to it again. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, and she is going to share with you a little bit about the entry chart or the activity that we had you do when you came into the room, as well as our agenda for the day. So Rachel, talk loud.
Okay, so I think we should look at our chart because it's riveting and everyone had done this. Did everyone get a chance to vote on the chart? Twice, okay, awesome. Okay, so at first glance, it sort of looks like we have some top contenders, which is methodologies and standards, demonstration of progress toward GHG neutral, and methodology for incorporating the social costs of GHG. And so that's 3, and it sort of looks like the Clean Energy Action Plan is another top contender. Glenn, is that sort of what you expected to see? Is that riveting for you?
It's definitely informative, but I really didn't have anything to go on before this. No expectations.
So this is sort of going to be a cornerstone of our day, because as you can see on the visual agenda here that I have provided for you, there's a lot of reviewing rulemaking and prioritizing on here. So this is sort of just a visual cue that kind of outlines our journey for the day. So intro and welcome, we've already done that. Welcome. We're reviewing the agenda, and we're going to hear some opening remarks from Dr. Glenn Blackman. At 9:15, we're going to have a chunk of time where we hear from 4 field practitioners and subject matter experts with some presentations. After the presentations, we're going to do a Q&A. So we're going to ask that everyone presents, and then we'll go into a 20-minute Q&A session. During that time, we provided note cards on some of the outlying tables that you can grab and fill out if you have questions, just to mark them down. So because we're asking you to hold your questions till the very, very end, which is 55 minutes. After we do some Q&A, we're going to go into reviewing rulemaking priorities, which will involve the chart that you came in and voted on. And then we'll update the priorities, which will be an activity. And then we'll take about a 10-minute break. During that 10-minute break, we're going to be reorganizing the room into groupings. So we're going to ask everyone to kind of get up and go for it so we can do that. We're going to need to shuffle all of the chairs. And then at 10:45, when we come back from the break, we're going to be doing a shift and share, which is going to be a 70-minute workshop. And for those participating on Skype, I have a worksheet queued up for you so you can have some participation. And then at 11:55, we're going to wrap up and hear the next steps from Dr. Glenn Blackman. We have 3 objectives for the day. We're going to identify areas where there needs to be rules. We're going to prioritize, again, the word of the day, areas where rulemaking is most important. And we're going to hear from practitioners and subject matter experts on what is most important. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Glenn Blackman, with some opening remarks.
It's the fabulous, famous Dr. Glenn.
And I am Glenn Blackman. I'm the manager of energy policy here at Commerce and the lead for this meeting. And I also want to express great appreciation that people are showing up to help us with this work, both those of you in the room and those of you who are online. It's really important that we get this involvement, and we definitely appreciate your participation in this. I do have one sort of quick reaction to seeing the way the priorities spell out, and that is that if I were at a small utility, I might be a little bit concerned about there not being a lot of priority given to that. And I just want to say that we're planning to do some more targeted work with the small utilities. They are not covered by the existing clean energy law and are coming into this. And we also know that they're pretty clean already. And so we don't have a lot of policy concern about their ability to comply with this. And we don't want them to get kind of dragged into all the stuff we might, impose on Tacoma Power or Seattle City Light or somebody like that. So even if that doesn't look like, the small utilities are going to get a lot of discussion here today, I want to assure you that we're going to find a way to do that through the process. So anyway, that was just a little side note, not something I'd even intended to bring up, but it struck me looking at where the dots were that if I were a small utility, I'd be concerned about that. So we are here today to talk about planning. We're talking about potential rules that we would have for the consumer-owned utilities coming out of Sections 6 and 14 of the Clean Energy Transformation Act. If you're here from investor-owned utility, or
So the Skype people can't hear on the mic, so I think we need to just go speakers. They're silent.
Okay. If you're here on behalf of an investor-owned utility or someone who advocates in front of the IOUs, thank you for coming. We will appreciate your input. Let's all keep in mind that we're working on rules for the consumer-owned utilities here today. Okay, so what we're going to do now is hear some presentations. The idea here is to try to help us, move from so many different things that we might talk about to more specific topics. And so I put out a call for practitioners, people who are running integrated resource planning processes, or people who are involved in, the stakeholder advisory committees or something like that, to come and give their perspective on how they see this new law potentially affecting the planning work, and their perspective on whether anything needs to be clarified through rules. And I got 4 wonderful volunteers to do that. And I'm deeply grateful that they agreed to do it. And so get started with that. And Kevin is going to be our first one. Kevin Galke is from the Energy Authority, a consulting firm that does energy planning work for a number of different utilities. He'll tell you a little bit more about that, and then he's going to talk about what he's seen so far in his work where the law might affect their planning work. So, Kevin, I hand you the clicker.
Oh, wow. This is a lot of power here.
It is.
So my name is Kevin Galke. I work for the Energy Authority. I've been there for 11 years. I'm a manager of portfolio analytics. I work on IRPs, some involvement out here as well as a lot of others in the business as well. So thank you for the opportunity to come here and present today.
Can everyone hear Kevin?
No.
Okay.
Really?
All right, I'll talk louder. All right. All right, so before we get started, a few goals that I want to discuss. First, I'm not here to dispute the law itself or the merits of it. I think it's important to understand where we are and realize, too, that there are implications to it. But again, to me, this is a math problem. And as we're looking at this, you know, I want to make sure that we have a good math problem that will lead to good results. So a lot of our questions here are based on implementation methodology. Can everybody hear me now? All right, cool. But one of the big things that we see is that especially when it comes to resource adequacy, especially in this room, given the implication that a lot of you aren't the balancing authority. And there is a slight disconnect here that consistency is success. Cool. A few things that we found when we were reading through this. One of them is especially where the social cost of carbon is. It's not clear to us how to include the social cost of carbon and where to include it from a scope perspective. So there's several schools of thought. One is that you include it for just the single utility, i.e. Seattle City Light doesn't impact Tacoma and the way social cost of carbon is constrained. There's the possibility to add it across all of Washington, maybe Washington and just the bordering entities, or all of WAC. And all of these have significant implications for the way the cost of carbon gets included and the price streams that result from that. And the other thing that we considered is for states that don't now, but will likely have actual hard costs of carbon. So in some of this discussion, what you'll hear me differentiate is hard and soft costs. For everyone's benefit, to make sure we're on the same page, I'll define a hard cost as a cost that you actually pay. A soft cost is something like a social cost. And while I'm not disputing that those are real social implications, if it's not something that you send a bill for in the mail, it's questionable just from a math problem perspective, how is the most reasonable way to treat it? And for instances in some of these states that will likely have carbon legislation and hard costs in the future, how do we include that now and moving out? So here's why this is important. So maybe we can scroll down a little bit. Cool. So, so from a really high level perspective, this is a very oversimplified look, but here's kind of how the IRP process works. So first, you develop all your assumptions. Fuel costs, resource costs, emissions, all of that. Then you look at you look at new requirements and known new builds. It goes from there through a capacity expansion run, where it looks at all of the existing models or all of the existing footprint that's out there, and it takes an iterative approach. It adds new generation as is necessary.
This is Kathy Callis, and I'm on the phone. There's a lot of noise, a lot of really bad noises coming through on your audio.
We're doing our best over here. We're going to try to ask everyone to mute their microphones again.
Yeah, it's almost like a lot of shuffling of papers, closing and opening, moving things around, that kind of sound.
Yeah, I think someone on Skype just needs to mute their mic. We've said it a couple times. If you can try to make sure your mics are muted, please.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're on the wrong. There you go. That's the email. Yeah. Cool. So and then present slide on the IRP, the fourth slide. Technical irony.
Yeah. That's what happens when you're the first
Skype irony. And then slide 4. Click.
So as we've gone from building all of our assumptions, we have looked at known retirements and known new builds and run through a capacity expansion piece where incremental generation is added and incremental generation is retired based on overall economics. The end result is you get a price stream. And that price stream is sort of your jumping off point for all of your IRP. And so getting that right is critically important. One of the pieces when it comes to the social cost of carbon really comes down to where in the process do you model. If you model it in the beginning and you look at the assumptions, if you model it that all of WEC pays it, it's a relatively level playing field. If you start carving out entities, say just the state of Washington, theoretically a high enough social cost of carbon drives up prices high enough in the state of Washington that you start to get flows that don't make sense. You start to see significant imports from California, even though those may not be realistic or what anyone would expect. The other piece of it is you could include it at the end in the IRP price stream and say, you know, these are costs in the market are not in any way impacted by it, but my resource decision should be. And those have very different implications for things like flows, the type of generation that'll be built and the units that'll retire. Also forward prices. These are big implications for the IRP and the resulting downstream. Another thing that for entities who are more marginal, in a model where everything includes a social cost of carbon, your generation stack is going to look a little different. And so because of that, your market, any kind of market purchases you're making are going to have a different carbon content. For people who are in the high 90th percentile, that may not matter for them long term, but for entities who are a little more marginal, it could be the difference between being 85% and 75%. So it's an implication we'll need to consider. One of the biggest pieces of it, though, is the lack of a capacity RA standard. And that's magnified by the fact that most of the entities, or not most, but a sizable portion of the entities in this room are the balancing authority. So in the current construct, there is no regional capacity standard. And for those who are part of Bonneville's system, you have to be balanced on an hourly load and resource level, and you get a financial penalty if you don't. The problem with that is that it's not very forward-looking. And so you may not see that problem until that hour. The other question of that too is if you see this and you expect to incur hypothetically $10 million in financial penalties, but the cost to cure that is $11 million, the optimization perspective may suggest that you just pay the penalty. It's a cost of doing business. But from a resource adequacy, keeping the lights on perspective, that may not be optimal. One of the other impacts that we see just thinking through the process is that when you start including things like social cost of carbon and a lot of the renewable standards, what it'll naturally do is add more renewable resources. Renewable resources have a lot of benefits. One of the implications of it, though, is that they tend to be zero or negative marginal cost resources. A zero or negative marginal cost resource changes the supply curve, tends to result in lower market prices. Lower market prices incent thermal generators to retire because they're not economic anymore. They don't make money. And so the implication is that what the models will tend to point toward is making market purchases, which there are questions long term about how deep is that market that you can actually buy. I mean, we've seen a willingness to lock up capacity and energy contracts out longer term, but it's not clear how much energy there is out there. And it might work for one or two entities, but not everybody can just buy from the market. So that is a consideration here. The last piece that we have is really, there is a transmission requirement to evaluate the energy and transmission out into the future. One of the issues that we see with this is that transmission is very, very locationally specific. And so what transmission is available is a function of what everyone builds. If everybody goes out and buys wind in Montana, there's probably not a lot of east to west transmission available. So these are things that will be considered. Also, at the same time, there's a transmission working group that is being developed. And so some of their conclusions, there are questions about how we should integrate that. These are the people who really, at the end of the day, should know exactly what's going to happen out in the future. So these are really our concerns as we look at this going forward. At the end of the day, there's value to having flexibility in this process. There's also value to making sure that, especially where reliability is concerned, that everybody is playing to the same standard. as we look out into the future. Thank you.
Well, that was great, for me at least. I love to talk about this kind of stuff. I don't want to do it, but I like to talk about it. Just to translate a couple points that Kevin made to that chart over there, that second category down, methodologies and standards, if you look in the back of your packet, you can see that that covers a lot of different things, and it goes up basically to the middle of the alphabet. One of those methodologies and standards is resource adequacy, and another one is the transmission adequacy. So, his third point about greenhouse gas, and I think we can all see where that goes. But his other 2 points, I would kind of line them up into that second category on the chart. Now I'm going to have Kelly Hall come up.
Wendy's next.
Is Wendy next?
That was my understanding, but I'm happy.
Now I'm going to have Wendy Garland come
Let me
up.
ask you a question. Does it mess it up
Kelly's
if I
sweeping.
don't, if I do it from here? Do I need to?
It will help with the sound in the room if you'll come up here. Wendy's not going to use a PowerPoint, but she can stand up here and be heard better that way.
Bringing my phone, not because I'm checking my email, but because I printed off my notes for what I was gonna say, and then I left them on my printer this morning.
Come
So-
this way just a little bit so that
Okay.
you're not.
So I'm
Yeah.
just gonna.
Yeah, you can sit here, that's good.
I like this.
Wendy's from the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, I'm just gonna throw out some thoughts. I think my purpose was just kind of more to get people thinking and also to provide the Northwest Energy Coalition's sort of unique perspective on these sections. Yeah.
Could you briefly talk about your involvement with planning and what your perspective is kind of coming into this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I work for Northwest Energy Coalition. We're a nonprofit group that works on clean energy, promoting clean energy throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. We do work in the legislature, so we were actually very actively involved in helping to form the CETA legislation. But we also do work in the regulatory environment, so we participate in a lot of the investor-owned utility integrated resource plans, rate cases sometimes. We also participate in some of the COU where they have more robust integrated resource planning processes. We participate with them in those processes as a participant party to the process.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question? Okay. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the purposes of CETA as sort of set out through Section 1, but filtered through Northwest Energy Coalition. And then I'm going to talk about how those purposes kind of filter through these sections for us. You can look at Section 1 and do this yourself, but from the Northwest Energy Coalition perspective, just a little bit about what we think is the key point, right, of the law. And that is transforming electric supply to increasingly clean energy, modernizing the electric system. And then the third one is this idea of equity that's within the law about sharing of benefits and also a new consideration of impacts from the electric sector on communities. And so those, I would say, are kind of our top three. This is what the law was meant to accomplish. There's some other important themes in the law, like job creation, recognition of the importance of hydropower to the region, and then also sort of the importance of customers and transparency is woven, I think, throughout Section 1 and also throughout the law itself. So the reason I'm talking about this is I think that it's really important. Section 6 and Section 14 are really essential sections to all of those purposes. And so when I was going back through thinking about what are our questions and what are the importance of these two sections, I went back and grounded myself in those purposes to see how those influence what we might want to do in rulemaking. For Section 14, I mean, what we're talking about here is really re-envisioning the utility planning process, re-envisioning it for these changes that we know need to take place. And because it's changes, I think that is a particularly unique challenge for rulemaking. It's not like we have one set thing that we're trying to accomplish that is easily measurable, that we can just set a standard in rulemaking and okay, we're done. We're talking about changing utility planning process to accomplish these goals. And that is going to require, at the same time, accountability to the purposes and making sure that utilities are making the progress on each of those purposes, but also flexibility, because we know that all utilities look different. So some specific thoughts for section 14 that brings up is this is going to include a lot more elements for utility planning than we've traditionally looked at through traditional IRPs. So we're looking at, yes, transmission, and localized impacts of transmission. We're talking about distribution system planning and localized impacts from that. We're talking about distributed energy resources and customer side as participants in utility planning, and it's going to get a lot more complicated. You can't look at just how many gas plants can we build anymore. You have to really look at all these interacting components in terms of your planning, and how do you set rules for that? Glenn's going to tell us. So some other specific things, resource adequacy, I think, is obviously a big topic for this group. I think at the same time, we recognize that our traditional modes of looking at things like resource adequacy or loss of load probability are outdated, but we don't know what the exact right answer is, and there might not be an exact right answer. Methods are evolving, and so we're going to have to write the rules to allow some flexibility for those methods to improve over time. I don't know that we're going to be able to say, here's the approach that all utilities have to use for measuring and a standard for resource adequacy. I don't think that we are at a point in time where we are ripe to determine in a rule, this is the exact approach. So we're going to have to be flexible, but again, with that accountability piece, so that utilities are using the best possible information to come up with a resource adequacy standard and metrics. Then moving down to social cost of carbon, this has obviously been a big topic of conversation. I think what I want to say is, from the Northwest Energy Coalition perspective, the point of this is to allow a more accurate cost accounting of resource choices. So a more accurate accounting of the comparison of the actual costs. And we understand that that social cost of carbon isn't really included in traditional financial cost metrics. And so there are some challenges, and I think the previous presenter pointed out some of these things, in terms of dispatch modeling and market price forecasting. We're going to have to sit down and figure out what's the best way to represent this cost that we know it's costing society, that we want to integrate into our planning and our consideration of resource choices. How can we get out of the box of this is the way we've always done it and it hasn't included that cost? What do we need to change in order to make that cost included in the best possible way in Washington, given that other states aren't quite there? And then there were some questions about the joint operating agreement. I think here's where I want to emphasize that I think we want to make sure we're flexible for different types of utilities, but also that we're holding individual utilities accountable and that we have transparency. So this is where the customer and the community piece comes in, that if we're going to do joint operating agreements or whatever the rules that get established, people need to be able to see what their individual utility is doing in terms of making progress on all of these things. And so we need to write the rules in a way that allows utilities to band together, share resources, share things where they need to and where it makes sense, but also have that individual accountability written in. And I might be going on too long, which I said I wasn't going to do. So let me move to section 6. And in section 6, I think there are lots of questions around the interim targets, the targets for energy efficiency, demand response, energy efficiency. And again, here's another situation where, as an advocacy group, we're sort of torn between, do we want prescriptive targets, like a common interim target that every utility has to abide by, or do we need to focus more on the process of how rulemaking is going to evaluate and how the public who's participating in evaluating how their utility is doing, do we want to focus on how that process is set up to allow that people to evaluate the utilities on the merits of what they're doing, but allow flexibility for our individual utilities who we know are all in very different situations to be able to make the best decision for their utility. And so I think there's a tension between those two things, and I'm hoping that within the rulemaking process, we'll find a good middle ground between those two tensions. And then, other significant questions are around the cost cap and when does it apply and how is it calculated? And I think we don't necessarily have, all the answers for any of these questions, but we do recognize that those are significant questions that are of interest to the utilities, and we want to set it up in a way that makes sense, that works for the utilities, and are interested in, discussing all these questions.
Great, thank you. That was really helpful. I appreciate it, Wendy. Next up, we have Snohomish PUD. Ian Hunter and Garrison Marr are going to present on their perspective on this. Come on up, guys.
Great. Right. So I'm Ian Hunter. I'm a policy analyst with Snohomish PUD. I was actively involved in the kind of negotiation and inception of CETA in the legislative session. I worked pretty closely with Garrison Marr.
Hi, I'm Garrison Marr, and I'm a long-term planner for Snohomish PUD, so have been active in the last 2 IRP cycles, helping us set our long-term resource strategy. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that strategy processes look like, what we think will stay the same, what we think will change, and then Ian will kind of walk us through some of the questions that we have, some of the pieces that are important to us from our perspective.
We're getting there on your presentation.
Great.
Maybe an extra minute, just because.
Perfect. Well, in this Slack time, let me tell you a little bit about us in the context that we have as we think about CETA. So we characterize ourselves as 98% carbon-free, not because we have any resources in our own portfolio that emit carbon, but because we're market participants and we have some market purchases with that imputed carbon into it. We're also an energy long utility, which means we have surplus energy on an annual average basis. So energy prices now and in the future are important to us, and policy changes that affect that energy price are also important to us. That surplus energy brings in revenue that can lower the cost of our product to our customers. We are also capacity short when we're in times of kind of challenging weather. Part of that is because we have a hydro-dominant portfolio, but also weather affects loads, right? So the capacity choices and capacity prices in the future as a result of policy change are also really important to us. So when we think about, well, what does our planning process look like? That's important, but we also care about what other people's planning processes look like, the choices they make, because that market mix change will affect the revenue potential that we have for our energy surplus and the prices that we might pay for whatever capacity resource it is that we might acquire. So I've rambled over my Slack time, but now you know about us. And this is what we were hoping to talk about today. So we want to talk about how we approach integrated resource planning. We think we're a little bit unique. We may not be. We're going to make the case. What parts of the IRP look like they're going to stay the same for us and what we'll need to change. And then Ian's going to walk us through, well, some of those changes we're not quite sure about yet. So what would be a priority for us to understand the soonest? So I'm going to show you an unreadable diagram to illustrate a point that I will narrate. Part of the reason we think we're a little bit unique is that we use an integrated portfolio approach. So when people think about integrated resource planning, sometimes they think about, this utility is thinking about what are the supply side resources that are going to meet my needs next. And that's really not the approach that we take. So we put conservation resources, supply side resources, demand response and DER resources all on equal footing. We calculate what our needs are, both in terms of energy, capacity, And we let our models optimize for affordable, safe, reliable, and environmentally sustainable long-term resource strategies. So we include, what we think our future contract's going to look like, the regulatory environment, but really, we can simplify this all to say that the blue bubbles on the left, that's kind of the entirety of the operating environment that we could see out there, the entirety of the choices that we think we have. And what we're really trying to do is to push that all into one process where we can ask the questions, what do we need, when, how frequently, and at what scale? What are the resources that we can choose from now and into the future, and what do they cost? Because what we're really trying to get at is this red box here. We want to have one adaptable, kind of a flexible, long-term resource strategy that steers us towards what our customers need now and into the future. And so what we think really happens as a result of the CETA is this red box is now populating more green boxes. And if you can't read what those green boxes are, they are our IRP. That's what we've done in the past. The Clean Energy Action Plan, which is a subcomponent of that IRP in the law. The 4-year Clean Energy Implementation Plan, which is kind of the near-term list of the things that we'll do soonest. And Ian will talk a little bit more about that. There's a little bit of interplay there that we want to make sure we understand. And then our compliance strategy, both for EIA and CETA. So, we want one efficient process that drives an overall strategy so we can make sure that we're making the best choices. So, in that process, what stays the same? Well, we're going to continue to use this integrated portfolio approach and put all those resources on equal footing. We will have a continued emphasis on the first 10 years of the plan. So we've done 20-year study periods. CETA will probably have a longer study period plan, but we're going to continue to have that emphasis on the first 10 years that we know the most about. That coincides great with the Clean Energy Action Plan, which also has that 10-year window. We're going to continue doing DER forecasting on the system. So we've done this the last 2 IRP cycles. DER forecasting to us right now means what do we think about electric vehicles? What do we think about behind-the-meter rooftop solar? We'll probably get into what we think about residential energy storage and things like that as well. But that's just a continuation of what we've been doing. Market depth and transmission capacity assessments. This is also something that we've done in the past, so this is not necessarily a new item for us. This is part of what informs our rules about what's available to us as we think about what are the resources that we might need in the future. And those rules we characterize as planning standards. Those are the kind of objective criteria our future portfolio needs to have. And we see corollary there with resource adequacy. We would probably characterize it as portfolio adequacy in our case, but we see an interplay there. We're a little unique too in that we're not a balancing authority. We're within a balancing authority. So the risks that we have and our customers have are different. And as a result of that, we have adequacy measures that mirror that. We'll continue to have CPA and DRPA. DRPA is demand response potential assessment. CPA is conservation potential assessment. We would probably add to that maybe the DRPA's demand management potential assessment to get a broader set of resources there. And we'll continue to use the societal cost of carbon. So we've done that for the last 2 IRP cycles. We have a process and how that's been incorporated. We've used a different discount rate in the past, but we'll use the discount rate that comes out of this process.
And I'll add just a little bit of color commentary. When we say, what's going to stay the same, we're not saying that it's going to be exactly the same as we've done it in the past. We recognize that there's going to be little tweaks that we may need to make to those things, such as the transmission market capacity assessment. There's a group that's going to be organized. We will hope to participate in that group, but we do see small tweaks, but not major overhauls.
So what will change in the process? Well, there's a new planning document that will come out of this process, the 4-year Clean Energy Implementation Plan. Ian's going to talk a little bit more about that interplay and one of the things that we're thinking about right now. The other is that we'll have multiple compliance pathways. So, when as EIA is part of our regulatory environment, there was a few pathways we could get to compliance. Now there'd be an additional EIA compliance pathway with 100% clean, and there'll be multiple CETA compliance pathways. So from a planning perspective or a modeling perspective, we have to evaluate all of these potential pathways as well to find the one that's going to be a good fit for our customers. And as I mentioned before, the policy effects are going to be important for us. So what that future market mix looks like and how it changes the market forecast fundamentals. So we want to know future energy prices, the distribution of those prices, what that looks like, and how that looks for our portfolio. And also we want to know capacity resources and what's changing there in terms of options and the imputed cost of capacity for the suite of resources available. We're a little different as well on timeline. So we have an 18-month process typically from start to finish for an IRP. We're a little counter-cyclical to some folks. So we are looking at 2021 as our end date for this next comprehensive IRP. And we also sync our timeline so that we can be budgeting for the next year's conservation acquisition. It's a foundational investment for us. Our budgeting season kind of kicks off in that spring period. So we want to make sure that we're finding out our 10-year window, our biennial conservation target, and budgeting for that acquisition of it all around the same time so that we have a coordinated planning effort so we can go out and get the things that we think we need. And Ian's going to talk through some of the questions that we have.
Yeah, sure. So this slide is going to look a little familiar. It's kind of mirroring the slide that says what's going to change in the IRP. We're going to talk a little bit about the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, which is a new report that will be mandated by CETA. We're going to talk a little bit about how utilities actually demonstrate compliance. A lot of us kind of think, oh, 2034, that's way out there. We got plenty of time to think about how we're actually going to be doing the math and the accounting, but maybe not. And then regulatory and compliance pathways for CETA and the kind of the interplay between CETA and the EIA. So first up is the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. It's informed by the Integrated Resource Plan. So if you look at the timeline that we had before, you can see that the IRP wraps up kind of in the middle of 2021, and then it's an informative. You're taking the information that you've gathered in your IRP and putting it into your Clean Energy Implementation Plan. We're seeing that as meaning that the interim targets are also derived from our IRP's long-term resource strategy. So the questions that come up is, the implementation plan is a 4-year plan, but IRPs are updated every 2 years. So how are those interim targets that we're establishing on a 4-year basis affected by changes in the IRP? And then how do energy efficiency targets that we have to set for our EIA compliance, how do those change? Because the implementation plan does require specific energy efficiency targets, but for setting those on a 4-year basis and have an EIA requirement for 2-year targets, what's the interplay? And then the last kind of question that we have are, how are our near-term actions evaluated as future compliance mechanisms from a portfolio standpoint? How do we get the costs and the benefits of the actions that we're taking now into our resource plan, and how do we evaluate those? The next piece is demonstrating compliance. The very broad question is how compliance accounting and how we're going to be demonstrating compliance will be handled. We assume that based on section 4.1a that the total load over the compliance period must be met with total renewable and non-emitting generation. And the key here is that how you account for compliance will affect your planning. What information is going to be required in compliance filings with Commerce? In a surplus portfolio, how are the attributes of your megawatt hours handled? And how are market purchases and market sales accounted for? And last up, the regulatory and compliance pathways. When using your 100% compliance method for the EIA, what information filings will be required by Commerce? Are they going to be the same as the compliance filings for CETA? Is the methodology going to be the same? Or is there going to be differing methodologies for the 100% compliance method versus the CETA compliance method? And I have gone over my time, so Wendy, you're not alone. And that leaves us with questions, which I think we're going to be covering in the next section.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
And Next up is Kelly Hall from Climate Solutions. She's going to answer all those questions.
With optimism and hope.
With optimism and hope. That's right. Kelly, you can start by giving a little background on Climate Solutions and your role in IRP work.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Hall. I'm a policy manager at an organization called Climate Solutions. We are a regional organization. We're primarily work in Washington and Oregon. I'm focused on Washington policy and also do all of our regulatory work. So played a big role in pursuing this legislation during the legislature, obviously playing a role in implementation as well, and then participate in a number of utility IRP processes here in Washington. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the four areas in Section 6 and 14 that I have a lot of questions around and think there needs to be some clarification. A lot of the topics were already touched on by the three previous panelists, but I will get into that now. So the first, again, it's been talked a little bit about is clean energy action plans, or clean energy implementation plans, which are related to clean energy action plans, but slightly different. So there are a couple different components in here, I think, that there are just questions around how they're going to be implemented. Starting in 2022, they must be developed every 4 years. And the way that we're thinking about these plans, the reason for them is really to make sure that long-term we are minimizing costs. So Wendy talked a lot about the goals of this legislation. The goals are to get to a decarbonized grid, which we think is hugely important and a foundation for decarbonizing our entire economy. In order to do that, we want to do it in the least cost way possible. So these plans are kind of meant to keep utilities continuously planning, looking for technological advancement, et cetera, but making sure that they are creating plans with interim targets and demonstrating progress every 4 years. The plans also need to include a variety of different targets. So it specifies that they are to include interim targets for meeting the standard during the years prior to 2030, so thinking from 22 to 2030, as well as from 2030 to 2045. Now, these are different than the standards, the net zero standard that's in 2030 and the carbon-free standard in 2045. These are interim targets to show that utilities are demonstrating progress along the way. Wendy talked a little bit about this earlier. I think it's part of our job to figure out what's that balance between flexibility and acknowledging that each utility is in a slightly different position, but also providing enough guidance that utilities know how they're supposed to be developing these interim targets, how they're supposed to be demonstrating compliance over time. I think that's really important that the rules clarify some of that. Then we go on to adoption of the plan. I'm primarily focused on COUs in this presentation because we're at Commerce, but the governing board must adopt a plan after a public meeting. I think one thing that is also important to clarify is how does the public engage in these plans? These are more formal adoption processes than we've had in the past with IRPs, and so how is public input incorporated into the plans? And what does that have to look like in the various IRPs? And then lastly, demonstrating progress. So we've identified all these actions. There's another component of the law that says utilities must, this no backsliding provision, where utilities must be demonstrating that they're making progress. What does that look like? How do we actually demonstrate that that's happening? Is that part of compliance? Well, what does that look like? I think is really important that we clarify. So second part, I know we'll be talking about methodology, I think, in a later workshop, but from a planning perspective, incorporating the cost cap, I think, is really important. So the language states, over a 4-year compliance period, the average annual incremental cost of meeting the standards or the interim targets needs to exceed the 2% increase of the COU's retail revenue requirement above the previous year. So part of the reason that this was over a 4-year compliance period is so that utilities, when you have major investments, you're not hitting that cost cap every year. So you can average it out over 4 years. You can spend up to 2% per year or 8% over 4 years. One thing that I think needs clarification is what does a 4-year compliance period mean? We have compliance periods starting in 2030 we have 3 4-year compliance periods and then 1 3-year compliance period. And so it doesn't seem right that the legislature was saying it has to be those specific compliance periods because they're not all 4-year compliance periods. So was the legislature saying that needs to be over the Clean Energy Implementation Plan 4-year periods, hence beginning, in 2022 through 2025? I think that is something that we do need to clarify because it makes a big impact on how utilities will be planning over the next couple of Clean Energy Implementation Plan cycles. I think the other thing to note here is just that this is meant as a cost cap protection, but also back to the previous slide, this is also meant to get utilities planning now, and so that we don't have big cost impacts starting in 2035, let's say, but that they're spread out over time and that customers are protected over time. So we think it's really important that utilities do start planning now, incorporating this into a lot of their planning. The second part is a little bit more on the methodology itself. The law does state that costs must be directly attributable to actions necessary to comply with the requirements of Section 4 and 5. That leaves aside all the other components of the law. So whether it is incorporating the social cost of carbon or some of the public interest language that I'll talk about, energy assistance programs. Just want to be clear that the cost cap was meant to just be compliance with the net zero standard and the carbon-free standard in 2045. So next thing is public interest language. We are, I think, fundamentally shifting out of a least cost type of framework as we plan. So, we've used a very similar framework for several decades now. And it's not that UTC and governing boards didn't already have the authority to define what is in the public interest, but I think the legislature gave some pretty clear direction here that fundamentally we're shifting away from a lowest cost type of framework. So I can have, I have this on the screen, but I bolded just a few of the provisions. An equitable distribution of energy and non-energy benefits. That's something that the utilities have never necessarily contemplated in their IRPs. And so direction on how does that get incorporated? A reduction of burdens to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. Same thing, these are new concepts that I think really need a lot of guidance from the rules. There's some others that I think are a little bit easier to quantify and get into IRPs, such as long and short-term public health, environmental benefits. Those are things that you can use, like the social cost of carbon or the social cost of pollutants. There's a lot of research that's been done, but still I think that we need some guidance here so that utilities are incorporating these types of components into their plans consistently and meeting the intent of the law, which is, again, a bigger, broader framework than just relying on the lowest cost. UTC has, lowest reasonable cost is the framework that we're working under now, and I think this absolutely will need to be updated, but I think that it is worth in the commerce rules as well, coming up with some sort of definition of what it means to have a lowest reasonable cost, incorporating these concepts. Okay, and last but not least, social cost of greenhouse gases. There are a lot of questions around exactly how this should be applied in utility IRPs. I think it's really important that utilities are doing it consistently, and so getting guidance on the rules and how it is to be incorporated, I think is really important. So one, I can't remember who talked about it earlier, but someone did, around what resources do you actually apply it to? Do you apply it WEC-wide to every resource in the WEC? Do you apply it just to resources in Washington State? Do you apply it to resources, just resources that are coming into your system? I think it's really important that this mirrors as close to what is happening in reality as possible, meaning that you should apply to any resource that is coming into your system to serve load. So I think this is just one area that is important to get clarity on. Second part is dispatch. When do you apply it? Do you apply it before your resources have been economically dispatched in the model, or after? Again, from our perspective, we want to make sure that it is accurately reflecting what will happen in reality. So making sure that is aligning with how you're applying it and when you're applying it with regards to economic dispatch. And then the last is clarity around which emissions are covered. So I think it's pretty clear that emissions at the point of generation will be covered, but how are we incorporating upstream leakage emissions? What leakage rates are we using? What global warming potential? Again, I think it's important that utilities are very consistent in how they're applying the social cost of carbon, and so guidance from the rules I think would be really helpful. So those are the kind of 4 big buckets of things that we're thinking about as we look to clarity from Commerce and the UTC on these rules, and hopefully the rules all align and are consistent and help utilities plan in the long term to get to a decarbonized grid.
That was great, Kelly. Thank you. Very meaty presentations across the board. And we will share those presentations on the website and all that, and continue to use those as we go through this process. Where are we on time and process, Rachel?
So 10:05 was our anticipated time to do a 20-minute Q&A, so we're actually right on time.
We're right on
2
time.
minutes ahead.
Unless we want to give folks a couple of minutes just to think about questions before we dive into questions.
Okay, so just a couple minutes to ponder what you thought. Take some notes so that then the questions will be even higher quality. That'll give the people online a little more chance to catch up with us if need be.
And we do have note cards and Sharpies in the room if you want to write your question down rather than ask directly. Brittany will come around.
Brittany will come around. Hey, sure. Your offering plate? Just for
That was a joke.
Your ideas. Offering your idea of clarify.
We did, as people were coming into the room talking about it, it was kind of like, you know, showing up at church or something and people sitting in the back pews. So we'll continue with that theme.
Here you go. Everyone's a credit. Thank you. I know you.
Do you have
Good time to ask questions?
Is it
Go
time?
for it, yeah.
And how long, tell me again how long we're
Till
going.
10:25.
Till 10:25, okay. Brad Smolko, UTC.
This question for Kevin, I think. Can you spend the next 3 hours talking about the relative merits of like where to apply the just under 3 hours? Social cost of carbon at the various stages that you just introduced it, you know, either at the plant, Washington, neighbors, wet-wide. I mean, if you have the answer, that's great. But if you just want to talk about the relative merits of each one and the pros and cons.
Sure. Looking at it on different levels, really. So we can look at applying it on Washington, sort of Washington and the bordering states.
Speak up just a little
Sorry.
bit, please.
All right. All right. Now, hopefully everybody can hear me. Yay. So really, there's 4 different places that sound reasonable that you could apply it. One is on an individual utility level. So in other words, something that impacts, like I said, something that impacts Seattle City Light won't be impacted in something that impacts, say, Tacoma. That will likely do a good job of modeling actual prices in the market based on the resources that get built. Because it is a soft cost, it will likely impact long-term resource decisions. But in the short term, it will probably do the best job of capturing the actual carbon implications especially in the short to intermediate term. If we apply it for just the state of Washington, or emissions flowing into Washington, you miss some of the ancillary pieces of it. It could be reasonable for it, but realizing that if you apply it to just Washington, you will likely get a different resource mix across Washington. To the extent that it is a higher price, your flows will naturally change. a higher price incents more flows into Washington from other states and renewables from other states. A lower price will incent effectively just different builds. If we apply it to the bordering states, it's that magnified slightly. If we apply it to all of WEC, what you end up with is a balance that is a much more sort of levelized playing field. The other question then is, what do you do with the hard carbon costs? Things like California, where California has a real carbon, call it a tax, call it whatever you want, it is a real cost. And how do you model that? And some of our other questions that we had considered is, for states that do have a cost, do you let the social cost of carbon effectively serve as a proxy for future costs? Or do you model those on top of the social cost? So these are long-term considerations. And I think it's important that at the end of the day, everybody on this panel could come up with their own methodology and their own set of very different prices and resulting resource mixes. And they could all be defensible. Making sure that we're all playing from a levelized playing field I think is incumbent on us now and out in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Follow-up question, if I may. Sorry, Glenn. Talk about the interactions of people using different applications across the state. Utility A applies it only at the utility level. Utility B applies it at the level. What happens?
You would likely end up with very different resource builds. And because a lot of these models have the ability to build organically. Part of the reason I look at this is, why do we do IRPs to begin with? Why are we all sitting in this room? It's to make sure we're taking a strategic look at where we're at now and out into the future and making sure that we have that. If you apply it across all of WEC, and you will likely get significant renewable builds. What I've seen in other models that I've run, even in other places in the country, is that more renewable builds, lower carbon intensity, but you also get much lower market prices. And so the implications in other states that don't have significant carbon restrictions, Wyoming, for example, you're going to get a much lower carbon intensity, which for some of the entities who are more marginal on the compliance, that could be significant to them. And then the question is, for their perspective, do you need a model run that effectively shows what carbon is likely to be with just hard costs, or do you need a second run that shows for planning purposes what you need with soft costs involved?
Kelly.
Can I just ask you a quick follow-up question? So I'm thinking that all makes sense, but I'm also thinking around, if you apply it to all of WEC, you'll have some potential resource retirements that won't actually be realized, and the impact of that. That's related to what you're talking about, but it's slightly different.
No, I think that's a very salient point. That if you apply it too far, your risk is that you apply it to places and you end up with retirements that aren't realistic.
Yep.
Or not realistic maybe on the timeline that they are.
Yep.
And so to the extent that you accelerate retirements, you can fundamentally change the carbon content, especially in areas that have long-standing thermal assets, particularly coal.
Yep. And I would think that would just have a big impact on capacity. So thinking about, you said it would result in a lot of new renewable builds. I would also assume it would result in a lot of new peaker plants as well, because there could be a capacity shortage.
Yeah, I would venture to say, yeah, there could be a capacity implication. The other thing to consider is that a lot of these models are not well suited to deal with reliability implications. Most of these IRP models are long-term economic models, and they don't do a lot with sequencing of hours, and they do a lot of time slicing. It's good from an efficiency perspective, but may not capture all the reliability and especially the incremental ELCC declines that we see out into the future.
All right, I'm looking for a question that's not about greenhouse gas methodology. Just to mix it up a little bit. John.
The utilities are being asked to prepare their clean energy implementation plans based on understanding of the costs of efficiency, demand side, renewables. I'm curious what research Commerce is doing, or maybe Northwest Energy Coalition or Climate Solutions, on those costs and how those are shared, how the research results are shared going forward.
Research on the expected costs.
Those expected costs.
Yeah, so I would say the Department of Commerce is not doing much with that at all. That work, I mean, and these guys could talk about this more than I could, but, you know, I mean, basically it's a national and international, you know, source of information about the future, what the best technologies are, and I think everybody expects the planners to use all the information that's available to them, and I don't think any of them would look to us as a source for that. Am I wrong about that? According to Commerce, a solar panel is going to cost such and such in 10 years. I don't think so. So anyway, but there is really a lot of good information. Does that answer your question? Or?
Everybody faces the common problem of accessing that information.
Yeah.
So it's just how do you accelerate the learning and make
Yeah.
sure everyone's drawing on the best available information?
Yeah, right.
I'm curious about that and how I can access it too.
Yeah. Any other thoughts people want to offer?
Well, I guess I'll say, you know, to me, that's one of the values of the transparency and the participation in the process. So, you know, for the utility IRPs that we participated in, there's often renewable developers sitting at the table that can bring information forward. And so just making sure that, I mean, I think that helps make sure that the relevant and timely information, the most accurate current information is being brought forward. It doesn't always guarantee it, but it's definitely, in my experience, a big contributor to it. And so that would be one thing that I would highlight as important.
And I do, I guess I would also add that even though we don't see ourselves as a repository of the studies and things like that, we are incredibly smart. Am I right about that, Sarah? I mean, we do see ourselves as, we hope anyway, that we are good resources on some of these economic, financial, and technical issues, and you know, often participate in some of the IRP work, try to bring that information to the work. So I don't want to sell ourselves short. Did I avoid that successfully? I think so. In the back there.
Well, another question that's not related to social cost carbon, but other social costs. So non-traditional utility costs that we're now going to have to start planning for as a part of the act. One concern we have is in the rulemaking process, we get a one-size-fits-all solution. Yet we've got a number of rural areas in the state that have very small populations and very large boundaries, and then in other places we have extremely tight urban areas that are highly populated. So I guess the question that I have is, how are we, as we're going through the rulemaking process and delineating actions that should be taken for compliance, how are we assuring that we're not forcing a solution on you know, targeted populations, but that are targeted in a rural area, which you know, their needs are oftentimes far different than maybe the same targeted type populations in urban areas.
And Paul, are you thinking in particular about what we sometimes call the public interest considerations, the things that Wendy was talking about that are in Section 1 of the bill, and that those might be different in different parts of the state? You're wondering how to address that in a rule.
Right.
Yeah. Thoughts on that, Wendy?
So one thing that I neglected to talk about, but you know, there's the language which I'm glad Kelly highlighted from Section 1, which talks about the public interest, which I think those are some things utilities should be thinking about. In the planning section, it references the cumulative impact analysis that's being done. But one thing that I was going to say in my opening remarks that I left out is I would encourage utilities and everybody in this room not to wait to think about that until that impact analysis comes out, because I think you're exactly right that that impact analysis is going to be able to be used as a tool by utilities, but these are inherently localized issues that are really about your communities and the areas that you serve. And I think, we have a varying degree of utilities that already are really good at outreach and have connections to community groups and the different entities that need, that they will need to engage with to really figure out how to integrate those things into their planning. And some utilities really don't do that right now. And what I would say is, if you're a utility that isn't doing that, you should start doing that now, because those are the people that are going to be able to help you understand how you incorporate that language from section 1 and how you interpret the statewide cumulative impact analysis to make it meaningful in your planning.
Right, but that extended my question to what we should be doing, and I'm really far more concerned about how we're going to apply the rules to actual practice.
Yeah, right, so does there need to be a rule for that?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I definitely think that there should be some consideration of rulemaking around it, but I think, again, going back, I think it should be probably more process oriented than it should be prescriptive, because I think there's just too many differences among the utility service territory and the types of things that they're going to need to consider.
Kelly.
And I mean, I would say the same thing. I think that part of this is coming up with the methodology for incorporating it. An example that I didn't give, but one of the things is economic development. And so how do you weigh the cost differentials between a community solar project that is in, whether it's a rural or urban community that maybe is identified a highly impacted community, maybe not? How do you calculate the cost differential between that and a utility scale project? How much weight should we give something that has all these other benefits? So I think that's exactly right. How do we go through a process by which we can figure out how can we quantify these benefits within a planning type of process? And I do just want to mention, I mean, it's in section 14, but it also is specified in how you comply with the law. So I am looking at this as much more than just a planning requirement, but it's overarching within the entire law as well.
I just checked to see if we had any questions from our web participants, and we don't right now, so I'll just remind those of you who are in that if you want to type in a question, we might be able to get to it. I think, Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, so I guess my cognitive dissonance here is, how do you square the public interest language that we're talking about here with the fact that we're all consumer-owns who have duly elected public officials who have our local public best interests at heart. And so I guess I would want to, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but it's something that, that is a real, I think, issue, because, we have a very strong set of commissioners who believe they do that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everybody else does as well.
Garrison or Ian, do you have thoughts about how Snohomish looks at the public interest questions?
Ian's giving me the look, so I'm
gonna do that a lot in this panel.
I'm gonna offer something, and then Ian can clean up my mess if need be. But I'm hearing a lot of the feedback from different parts of the room, and I'm really nodding my head in agreement to a lot of it. I guess from the planner's perspective, we're great at coming up with methodologies. And the folks in this room are right that our community's needs are a little bit different from each other based on whether we're a balancing authority, how we participate in which markets, and the flexibility to reflect our communities with a methodology that makes sense is something that we really value. And, there's lots of different places in this legislation where there's some choices that you could make. And having the ability to make the choice that reflects your community and is responsive to your board is something that I think will continue to be really important for us.
We've heard some concerns about, urban versus rural and how you might apply those rules for two different states. But Snohomish PUD really has both. We kind of have the Everett Metro Center right in the kind of southwest part of our county, and then the rest of it is rural farmland and kind of mountainous terrain. So we really do have to think about, does a one-size-all approach fit? Probably not. We probably value flexibility more.
And I mean, I'm trying to think of exactly how to say this in the right way, but I just came from, a national conference where this issue of integrating equity was a big topic of conversation, and COU board came up. And I guess I'll just say, with absolutely no disrespect to current board members or, any questions about how they're representing their constituents, I do think that there are a lot of feelings across the country, so I'm not targeting anyone in specific, that system that's set up right now is, and of course it looks different, but it may not be representative really of all of the different community members that live in a particular place. And so a part of this really is about challenging some of those traditional systems and mechanisms for electing board members or what have you, and saying, are we getting a truly representative system here that's considering everyone's needs, or are there some things that we need to think about or do a little bit differently to integrate a more comprehensive view of that into the planning? And that's a hard topic, and I think it sits uncomfortably with a lot of us, but I just feel like it needs to be said in this room that is one of the points of the language that was in the law. And I think the Northwest Energy Coalition and other groups are going to come and keep bringing up that topic and challenge people to think about it in a new way.
Okay, Nicholas.
So a couple of things.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, many of the utilities that I work with are full requirements customers, and therefore they really don't have much of any influence on the power that they provide to their customers. It all comes through BPA, and we need to have to make sure that the methodologies that we have account for that. And the other thing I just point out is that being dominated by hydro, any given year can look very different from any other year. And so how do you deal with making sure that the rules, whatever they are, allow for the flexibility to know that, in a dry year, I'm not saying a drought year, but just a drier than normal year, you're going to have a different level of carbon proportion than you would most likely in a wet year. And the other thing to think about is that even if you have a wet year or a dry year, you could have the distribution of rain such that you would have periods when you're going to have to call on thermal resources in order to maintain reliability, and making sure that when you get down to demonstrating compliance, the reality of the hydro system isn't lost on the compliance demonstration.
Do any of you guys have concerns about the ability to incorporate those into the planning process? How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, I think the tension between your actual compliance obligation and your planning obligation, that's going to be an important factor to think about, where the variability may not necessarily, you'll think about variability in your planning, but you're also planning kind of on an average basis, versus when you actually go to comply, you're complying year by year with very different hydro conditions. And so that tension is going to be important to consider in your planning, and especially as you start thinking about compliance, which has an impact on planning.
Yeah, I just want to point out that it's compliance period by compliance period.
Right.
It is a 4-year intervals. Boy, did we talk about that a lot during the session.
Yeah, I mean, let me just add too that you're getting all of your supply side resources from Bonneville, but you are in charge of procuring your demand side resources. And there is clearly a very strong demand side component to this legislation. And so I guess I would say for us, the emphasis is going to be, for the full requirements customers, is going to be on that piece. And how well are you doing at planning and acquiring the demand side resources that we all need you to acquire in order for us as a state to get where we need to go.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this panel presentation part. I found it to be really informative, and I want to thank you again for doing that. Will you guys be around to sign autographs later? Anyway, thanks a lot. And Rachel, tell us what's next.
All right,
You got a bell, watch out.
I got a bell, and that bell is your cue to listen up to me. So the next thing on our agenda is review rulemaking priorities. So how we're going to do that is my invitation to you is to turn to the person sitting next to you, or maybe there's some groups of 3, and I want you to think about, after hearing presentations, have your priorities for rulemaking when you came into the room changed since you've heard the discussion? And are there things that are missing that are not on this list that you feel strongly that you want to talk about today? So I'm going to give each pair 4 minutes. So your time is now. Does anyone have any questions about my invitation? Okay, you have 4 minutes. Turn to the person next to you. Think about this.
I don't
Okay, so now we're going to have everybody back with me. So now we're going to talk about updating priorities, but before we do that, since we're on the heels of a break and our next activity is interactive, so you're going to get up for it, I'm going to have everyone count off by 4s because the next thing that's coming after the break is a workshop. What I'm going to have you do is count by 4s, whatever number you are. I want you, when you get up, to move your belongings to the flip chart areas because we're going to reorganize the chairs in circles. So may I start with you? So you're one. You're, he's leaving. You're two. Three.
4. 1. 2.
3.
4.
1. 2.
Oh, but we'll go here.
3.
4. 1.
2.
3. 4.
1.
2.
3. 1.
2.
3.
I'm leaving.
4.
1.
2. 3.
4. 1. 2.
3. 4.
1. Yeah.
2. 3. 4.
1. Okay.
Tony's 2.
I'm leaving.
You're leaving? Well,
Okay, so if everyone can remember their numbers, I'm gonna invite you to get up, and I'm going to invite you to have an opportunity. You're going to all re-vote on the priority item. There are different colored dots that Rebecca and Brittany will hand out, and there's post-its to place anything that is still missing.
gotta get home.
Green dot, same thing, right?
Oh, yeah. It was all the counts.
I know. I know, but I was looking very quickly like, okay.
Yeah, good luck to you too.
I don't know if that's right now or on the way back.
Rachel, are they doing the revote now? Yes, you are re-voting now. 3 documents.
Be in the office, right? I saw your name. Have a little extra time for the. I know. Really appreciated working with you. Thank you.
Yeah. 10:45, so we reconvene.
10 minutes for coffee.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, we want like a circle. I need a couple more. Thank you. I'm gonna have to people. Oh, yeah, sorry. 11 chairs, 3.
Put it on your desk.
I know. We have to.
I know.
Good.
In Washington.
But AC cranking. I feel it.
Okay. You're pumping.
There's one in the reactor.
You did your, I know. Yeah. I need people to help organize the room, so I need people to.
Morning, how are you?
Okay. All right. Part was great, but there's not enough room here. Okay. Let me work on.
Oh, yeah, that's
good.
It was a good thing it wasn't yesterday, right?
Yeah.
A little confused.
Yeah. And it's just part of the team here.
No, informally.
Oh, your back on the door. I knew it was Well, Rachel, are you going to meet with the group facilitators? Yes. Yeah. So it's Emily, Michael, Sarah, and Peter. Give more room. We're moving, yeah. Oh, because they're going to be back to back. What do you think? Yeah. I'm Johnny.
Well, I think what I want to do, I think I want them to talk about how they are successful. I got this by one of the suspects in Seattle. And, I'm just kind of digging.
Hi, don't mind us. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, we had to think this year. My family's all
I better be paying attention. So the assume that you have. Send me names. So Philip is one of those. Well, I think that's particularly close. Smart about gorilla. And what is particularly big.
Methodology for incorporating psychosis.
So you listen to who everyone goes on.
Oh, we're doing it there?
Yeah, because otherwise these two are too close.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I changed my mind after we set it up.
My lady.
We're going to trap you in the number.
Yeah, we are going to track her.
One circle.
Forever. I think which one? Change her mind.
When you can. Still clean energy action. I need a blend. Okay, Red. We have a tiebreaker with 5 green dots after the vote from Target. Well, How come I only have this one? We have a tie. They're spread out. You should have them at your stage. Clean energy action plan. Which one would you rather have people discuss? Okay.
I haven't voted yet.
Oh, you better get your green dots, okay? All right. So that's the bucket? Oh, goodness, those are yours. Sorry, honey. I need to pair those note takers together. So I'm going to switch well, I think you're out here. So can I pair you with Sarah and you and Sarah's note taker? Yeah. Okay, Sarah's going to be, you're the note taker. You'll be in number 1. Oh, you're in 1? Oh, you and Sarah are in 1? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll be with you, Emily, and you're note taker.
Yeah. All right, good, thank you. Yeah.
Once you find your space, we're probably going to move it, just so you have no idea where it's going.
Rachel.
Oh, she knows. I'll ask her.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Oh, okay. I was gonna write it on the. Sorry. Hello. What's wrong? Erratic.
All right.
I was trying to think about food.
Yes,
like
we're
a
not
real
back to
like salad bar.
all
Yes,
my
Rachel
bells.
is
And
doing
you'll
it.
definitely know. I'll be very loud.
Perfect.
What number are you? One. So this will be your corner.
Yeah. All right. Me and one. Okay. What's that? We're here. There and we're here. And there's no leg room. It's right.
Yeah, you're leading this. I've got to get my knees and my
If you want to start making your way to your corners, we're going to get going in a few minutes.
I will bring you over. I think we have some revenue in this basket.
Great.
Michael would like to take care of it. I have Michael, you want to take care of it? Like 4 years that felt like 10, right? Because he was Asian legislative.
I know.
I was there.
I'm good.
Sure. All right, let's go over here. Oh, wait, we're not starting there. Ready to get started? We're going to get started. We've got a resettlement room. We moved around a lot. So if you could take a moment to find your way to your numbered flip chart if you are a 1. We're not going to mix it up. You are with the 1 flip chart over here. Brittany?
I got the 1.
2s are over here in this corner over here with J. Ray. 3s, back way over there back in the corner, and I think you're with Melissa. And then our 4
doors are over there. So hopefully we got your stuff where you need to be. If you want to make your way to your spot, that would be great.
Are you a two?
Inward if we can, so that we're not in another person's group. If you're able to slide in, thank you. All right, thank you. Sarah.
Sarah, we don't have a SME.
I'm standing in the back.
It's okay. We're missing a SME.
She's coming back. Sarah, I'm with Sarah. I know he's over there. Wait, you'll know who you are with the SMEs from Commerce. Raise your hands. Okay, we need Bob. Bob, we need you down here. Michael's his own SME. All right.
Well, apparently it's no. I'm going to take my tea.
All right. Okay, so we haven't. You are. We're just going to stare at each other until Sarah gets back. Okay. Oh, is Sarah still in here? Yes. Well, I'll go ahead and when everybody has their seat. We appreciate your graciousness. We do not have a really large conference room here at Commerce, and it is a thorn in all of our sides. So, yeah. So what we're going to do in this next section, we're going to do what's really called a shift and share. You're going to start out in your pod with your group, and you're going to spend 10 minutes, and we're going to be having a facilitated conversation, capturing notes around the question that's on your, or the area, the area that was on the flip chart that you all voted as a priority for consideration for rulemaking. And so we're going to give you about 10 minutes as a small group to have that conversation, and then you will, are we going to move the flip charts, or are we going to move the people?
We're going to move the people.
We're going to move the people. So then you're going to get up and move to your left to the next station. So the ones will come to here like that. Does that make sense? Do we have our fabulous Sarah yet?
We have her. She's
Oh,
here.
awesome, awesome. So anything you want to add, Rachel?
So I believe Glenn will be milling about to help with the tough questions.
Yes. Dr. Glenn Blackman will be around. If you get in a jam, have a question, you need an expert opinion, raise your hand and we'll find somebody. Oh, sorry, Glenn.
Rebecca, quick clarifying question.
All right, with that, go ahead, get going.
Rebecca,
Yes.
how long have you been in this group?
10 minutes and then 777, but 10 minutes in the first one. And I'll ring the bell when it's time to shift.
Expert here, so I'm going to bring
Yeah.
Bob.
Sorry.
I'm just here to sort of see those.
I think that the first 2 minutes, I want you to have one concern, one question.
I think it's going to be great feedback for questions and answers.
I'll grab you a couple.
It's basically a very broad conversation. You don't capture anything that is on your mind.
I actually, it's almost done with the tattoo.
Right.
It's on my back.
So I'm just going to pick your deal
floating
first,
around.
see, if there's particular topics or questions that have been posed. And, even if you want to just go, through it letter by letter, but I think it's better to just maybe popcorn them. And then we have a lot of time kind of march through the end. So does anyone?
Sorry. Okay, once you're ready, just hand it to me.
Brittany will be our note taker. So does anyone want to hop in and kind of talk about, so the kind of general question that gets posed is, should a rule specify the methodologies or standards for any of the plan components subsection A through J? And I would actually clarify that.
He is simply applying recs to meet the whatever.
And that, I think he meant that as the methodology for integrating actual.
Yes,
But I would say that there's general conversation that needs to happen around the methodology to.
No, this is more standard, different than the EIA.
Clarification, we're talking. And you don't have to.
No, if there's other suggestions.
Anyone want to throw out a question?
So are you thinking about whether, like, there are dimensions, like,
I don't understand.
Do we have to do it?
do we also need to have a certain level
wind,
demand response.
that,
Exactly.
obviously,
when we
think
about
it
through the rule, given, just sort of regulatory
Yes. And as we're talking about this,
Any other clarifying questions before we start? Any
doesn't provide any direct,
Thank you.
maybe indirect EPA, but then who's gonna pull the trigger on EPA or?
Things you want to add on, those are suggestions.
1 minute.
Generating concerns and providing feedback. So maybe the first one can be, does everything, do clarifications need to happen through rules? Or are there other ways to provide clarification?
I guess I'll.
Questions? Okay. So.
In your clean energy implementation plan, I think the law is
Real
pretty
quick, can you
clear.
guys hear
that
Sean?
at a
Okay.
minimum
There's
have
another process. So I already have the resource
energy
out.
efficiency,
How will
demand
departments,
response,
I'm just gonna read these through in the beginning.
and so I think
What
that
happened on there?
when
This
prior
departments.
that the utility at a minimum creates those, we target over a 4-year period. Now whether
Big one I'm gonna
you're
put on the
doing
how does this process
allow that or not, but I think the law is pretty clear that you're gonna have to
No, it's not a state
but
process.
regionally, I would also put on their agency wide as well.
My response would be that
Do you want to go
subcommittees
through
might
these?
find.
Yeah, I mean, that specific work for Northwest Power Schools.
Or, let's just say demand response, it's not even
I've got my
argument.
eye on it.
Question.
Okay. What is our
I
objective?
think that's a good
Avoid
question
having
about
to
whether or not like
set, really detailed adequacy standards.
For methodology.
That's the thing, I guess, like, from my understanding of that, of my involvement, that it's ultimately a voluntary program, so how do we,
That's what I was
could be
talking
a
about.
voluntary program, and so how do we, look at regional processes that are still not mandatory, but, in some utilities
Right.
being
Yeah,
instituted,
or
some
as
may
I was
not.
trying to minimize.
And so the rules, I guess
Field
I would
service,
just say
so
is
far
they have to
costs,
still
carbon
have rules or the standards that are flexible enough to recognize. Or is the, or, because otherwise CETA could,
Is it a localized
say,
function that I'm
make
trying to
something
solve?
mandatory that
Is
isn't
it a
necessarily
statewide function?
mandatory, doesn't have to be mandatory.
You're
So I think that's,
There is an
that's my only
implied
thing to
maintenance.
let us all think about is
We're not going to set ourselves up
what is still
farther
a
over
utility.
time to then achieve.
I look at when you just, state by state, looking at the.
I need to finish that one before we go on, sorry.
I didn't see the no backsliding.
Here, I'm
Oh,
not.
the comment.
I'm gonna pause
Yeah,
it.
my name is Amanda, and I work in Northwest.
Right, progress is the actual terminology.
We're not supposed to answer these, it's just
Thou shalt not do that. They do have variability in that.
Right, no, agreed. And I think that's one of the reasons why it actually is to recognize an incredible amount of activities that, but in general,
So first one,
The only
inconsistent calculations.
used to pass the bill, because they would apply to all of them who are getting more.
things like, and that's why the language is written that says, like a large loss of load.
So here's where it's so here are two parts of that, right? Like using that
You have
themselves
capacity
that have
to
flexibility or captures. I think
I guess the question is,
I would have a high around elements to them,
Yeah.
but then also the ability to
what
update and have information and
Definitely clarity around.
I think especially the especially the main spec, we should be taking into
Concern that plans will
Each
not.
utility starting out is positioned differently, so they have different needs at the beginning and different ways that may be more applicable to them. Because if your hydro variability is
And then
different
limitation of
from
modeling.
somebody who has thermal plants.
Reality.
So there's just different considerations for
Application
based on
on
utilities and the way they're
I'm
positioned.
hearing.
Demonstrating it.
So this idea of baselining, I think to show you how we're gonna get all the way, but that's just right now is setting a baseline for how we're gonna think about
Having 3 out of 4
some cases it's gathering
adverse
data we don't
condition years and going,
have
well,
after it on.
that's not really the same.
Well, I mean, I may have got there.
Inconsistent calculation.
But the other thing I wanted to add
Okay.
is, that fully across each other. There is no language that says there's like a way, like a process that is works well. So what I would say is
approach
look
to
at apples to apples, you'll need a lot more
is an adaptable
a
process.
lot more transparency, and so I guess maybe
I think there's a still what level of data, you know, in terms of
how we satisfy this portion of the law,
then would be
but it's
required
going
to
to
do
need to
that.
be open-ended enough to account for those
So
differences between
application has limitations.
And you then, did I completely then derail from the first point that you made in language?
Well, I think the point is that people are,
Consequences,
they're,
unknown or inconsistent.
I think the question is how far
That's something that needs to
should
be
this
considered.
process go? What is it trying, what are we really trying to capture? I think at the same point, what are we really trying to isolate and capture for the standards audience this is the impact. Here I set a standard and this is the impact I expect to have. And then we'll be able to know better what the standards should be. So impact may be that
Spent a lot of time
we're
arguing
absolutely certain
over
as a
how to
region.
accomplish something, and it really
The
ends up
application
being and other times you have
Where
something
does
that you think is going to be really
risk
simple,
fall
when
in?
in
Because
fact, once you
typically
get into
utilities have had some
that sort of stuff.
the world, there's no one right way. Like, you know, if there was an absolute right way to do this, NERC would have set an absolute specific standard if everybody knew how to measure it. So anything with
there is
a gray in there,
conversation that was started about
nothing is 100% physics, so we're
so
gonna
on
get
a
it
utility by
absolutely
utility
right
basis, for example,
all
or
the
at a regional
time.
level.
So I'm
And
hearing
the question that I
so
have
this
I'm going to leave this back really
is
quickly and we'll come back to the end. So
So
one,
and then how does
economic
if you're
value
already
of
subject
economics.
and what that might look like.
We'll come back to it. And then the other one was lack of coordination for rescuing quality. That's something you're actively working on, so
Maybe
we can talk about that. So I want to address these two comments. One is consistency is important. So, right, ties with growth and concern.
how you say
Exactly. So I'm confused about how those two, because I might advocate, like Ed and I are talking about, that a utility should be worried about their own needs and what they are focusing on, what their needs are, and how they're gonna comply with the law. But on a transmission or reliability basis, like the Power Council right now has to be working on their next model for a very, regional perspective. They're not gonna say the same thing. And cost, reliability.
Yeah,
Anything that we're looking at is gonna
so we're expanding
of who is put in and then the footprint that you're applying it to. So I'm just curious.
relying on them to do the work and do these models. So it's both, how do we bring
Yeah.
So I'm gonna comment on the practicality of what's gonna go on to some degree.
I mean, they've been doing carbon downers for a while, but using the social cost and
Liz, nice to meet you.
Transparency and then.
So this law doesn't tell.
one of the
how
things-
So I think we have
to-
one issue left. So I
Was there a
would
second
my
part?
job
I think there's new generation as well.
Just
Because
said,
you need to know what's getting built.
mostly on
In order to
concerns
be
and
able
I'll
to make an
highlight
accurate
some of the questions
forecast.
during class.
say, how does
So just remember, concerns are
institutions or entities that
capacity.
So I'm just saying we don't know, but it seems like there's nothing regulating them from doing it. So the question is, do they really?
Mason
So-
retires generation.
Think about those key man guys,
So
and that was.
I didn't know that I can't
Well,
help
yeah,
that,
we have
even though somebody who's been doing
We're
this
gonna
process
do
for a
there.
long
We're
time.
gonna do the flip chart and the right?
So that you can make a sort of holistic plan. Same thing with capacity.
Are y'all stay where you are?
We can't all account.
So what's going to happen?
Clean your room again, and then you'll end up at the station at the very end.
So what's gonna happen, we're gonna move Melissa and Emily in the flip chart, and you can stay comfortable, and you're gonna get a new flip chart, and a new, and a new, thanks you guys. Give gifts. Oh wait, no, we're state employees, you can't.
Easier to move 8 people.
You're going here.
Yeah, visibility is a better idea.
Michael, you're going over there. So we made an executive decision, rather than having y'all get up and move, we are going to take your fabulous subject matter expert and recorder, and you guys are, you're moving over here. So Sarah, Brittany, say goodbye to your friends. Good luck to you. Friends, say goodbye. Oh, and take your flip chart with you.
I could just take the number.
No, you gotta take the flip chart. I come in here.
Visibility is a better idea.
Come on. I gotta bring the flip chart with me. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's okay. Guys, we were actually doing the entire flip chart and taking your stuff with you. You're not gonna Okay, I'm going to have you go ahead and get started in just a minute while we're still organizing, but I just want to say thank you for your grace with us as we move around the room. And with that, we're going to... talking about methodology. Oh, they're coming. They are on their way. All right. Thank you, though. Appreciate that. Okay. All right. We're going to give you 7 minutes in your new group.
This is where some of the question we had here was expand beyond the integrate the progress report. How
Yeah, they're what they fill out.
Question about all the methodology.
So the one we're doing is methodology
Or anything else.
Have some
Oh
extras.
my gosh.
Yes, we have extras.
Yeah.
There are some places, some unintended consequences of methodology, including
What is animal conversation
another
about?
group of concerns was around inconsistency of the methodology for each methodology and then the flexibility and desire.
Expanding the scope of what is presented in the plan.
There seem to be a lot of metrics.
Competing, but also similar themes. And then the last thing we had was concerns around the methodology and the reality. And we had 2 other concerns. Having forms like how integral are these terms to the law, how integral are they actually being able to so, again, those are the consequences.
Let's talk about both. And let's think about what our concerns are and what feedback you have.
Concern around inconsistency.
Do you feel like it would be more effective?
Well, there's a 10-year plan and there's a 4-year
The questions that
implementation.
were
They're very different conversations. I just don't know which one you're talking about.
the input from utility.
Well, that's the implementation plan is 4 years.
That's
I always use the
10 year. I think
years
this is
to clarify. 10 years, it's good to clarify. 10 years intervention plan. Whatever this is, let's do it. Those words are
Consistency is important. So that is consistency versus flexibility. And then request methodology suggestions from utility subject matter experts who are already using social carbon.
Just a very. So when had a question come up, another thing that came up in the conversation on something like retention.
Yeah, questions, comments, or concerns that are not right on here.
People that have not been part of this before, so we need to have the information from them. How do we kind of expand the tent, bring people in, continue this transparency?
accountability.
Here's some Sharpies if you need
There
them.
may not even know they're gonna be implicated in this process. And the transmission about cost, they also.
I always use the years to clarify. It's a 10-year energy action plan or a 4-year methodology.
Inconsistency versus flexibility.
That was something that also.
I think that
How this methodology
And
will
then
reflect
line
reality.
that work out.
Questions were, what is our
10
objective
year
function and
are
responsibility over there?
Regionally,
Would
nationally.
that include,
It's
it's going the other way too?
It was
With
Closely
there was
flexibility
one
versus
way
variable.
to say.
Maybe it wasn't planned, but as a result,
How will the streets,
Your thoughts
new
on
loads,
How do we again?
I'm just saying that
benefit to have
as
rules setting out.
having
absolutely.
comments where
Like Dave said,
components-
businesses that wanna have in their value
The
system,
airplane as we're flying it.
carbon.
So.
And then, okay.
Absolutely.
What do we?
If you have, let me
What
know
do
if it's a question, comment, or concern about different targets.
You know, in terms of commerce to implement that the right way? Is it rules?
Oh, absolutely.
Which rules?
That's a
you
good
know,
deep part
which things definitely.
That being said,
Right.
comments.
Well, here's the issue here that you're talking about is no greater than we should see as a spring mecca. How does Grant County deal with, I made the other utilities
it sounds like some
in
clarity.
Washington, right?
And then what's the role of rulemaking?
How do we deal with massive growth in an environment where we're expected to comply? There aren't, right, established on the margin, every one of those things, there's a lot of going
Kind of like
water.
interim targets could be.
There's always
hard to
go
grasp sort
about
of additional ones.
I'm agree. My question would be, how do I adjust? Is it necessary to give commerce to some consideration for
Progress or being there.
Absolutely. No, it's not addressed. And then, so your example is, wait a minute, what if we're agreeing this about how to actually, for commerce, say, we are not agreeing. We recognize that there is this ambiguity, and we are going to see how it plays out. And then, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, we can say, oh, it's not playing out well, we need to do it. And that'd be a perfectly reasonable decision after, you see whether or not it's something that's working or not, but
What is it?
it's gonna be
Question?
it's very difficult to establish a resource
Thank you.
allocation
I
standard, because
Whatever other.
and the WAC have been talking about that
Or
for
what
15
if
years.
last-
One and done. amount of renewable energy, but it wound up costing twice as much.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's,
I'm gonna read, I know you're
frankly,
still
there's
writing.
nothing wrong with it, but it's hubris to assume that we could.
Question, how will differences in modeling at IR?
No, and you know,
So is
then my
it
question is
or
back to
more like how solutions, like it demonstrates straight out progress and still allow you to
I
make
do
some adaptable decision process.
Okay, next line, so I'll repeat that. How will differences in modeling at IRPs and resource adequacy definition?
You know, it seems to me like implementation
Where
is
of
two
the
things,
whole array
because I
of
think
social
the
costs of carbon
rule
and
says
IRP, so is it gonna be
implementation.
That's right, so that they play
Plan strategy, but there needs to be flexibility.
why I'm glad that you
As a group,
Customer generators, are they useful?
so,
Next comment, potential for disconnect.
So somebody had mentioned that, hey, we want to see progress because we don't want to get.
So how can plan and then perhaps on side.
Analyst?
That's the license that $1 a day is worth more than.
Just to chime in, yes, that's, let's talk about it.
I want to use it.
We heard another consistency, so we need to really talk. In particular, with, we're not gonna have changes coming like this.
Economically, I'm actually doing more than
You know, is it an apples to apples comparison?
I have to say, hey, my plan is to meet clients
No,
today.
it's not about progress, it's like about feedback on how to better work on that or address that. Like a rulemaking.
Bill, fine.
Well, so
Economically, that's easier for our customers. Less
Thing to go down, so I'm just kind of curious how that.
Than forcing them to pay your money.
I mean, I guess that's where
Because of the
it's,
dollar amount.
But you know, other things too, how you see that, how you track it.
I always hear.
No, I'm saying, the argument is that we need to minimize the effect
If you don't keep up with
progress
the
or
rules,
the time.
wrong.
It's not trying to
It does
get them to pay more
require
money up front sooner. produce,
regular
that is actually more economic damage. If we want to learn our rule,
So
wait until the very
I guess
end.
it's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, how
Put
useful
something
is
in
that?
place
And,
and
you know,
let
as
it
far
go on
as
autopilot.
So
Yeah, I mean,
we
did talk about that in the scenarios in your IRP process.
Right.
whichever one is lowest.
And this would be, I guess, in how to use methodologies and standards.
Seasonal RFPs, but continue to give it social societal cost as part of it.
Tell me what you think later, but it's just something I feel
There's
have is a place to show growth. Okay, but we also need flexibility to design this thing as we go.
Different area, but I mean,
So I guess I'm just trying to
talking about too is accountability, setting these plans and miss the value.
Yeah, I think those
Clarity about who's involved in the planning process.
And we don't have the input.
And what is accountability? Yeah, he wanted me to say.
I think having feedback on remediating areas, having some alignment there between the IRP process, because it has to be, how do we, they're related, but I think back to the flexibility piece, making sure that you didn't say at one point done, we need to do X, and now you want to pivot slightly.
Totally, yeah, so right,
So
I don't
I
think
think
it's
the first round of IRP walked in, because they don't belong.
Okay, so I know time goes by really, really fast. We'll have our facilitator and our recorder switch. Hopefully a little less, more seamlessly this time. You guys, you're coming back over to here into a new group. Yes, so every group gets a chance. So take the whole flip chart.
Yeah. We made it bring it back.
No, I got this. Well-oiled machine. You're over here. What's that by us? All right, we're going to give you 7 minutes with your new best friend. All right, you guys can just start when you get there. I know. You guys don't have to move.
I just want to, okay, so we're going to chat about that.
What we're working on is methodology for incorporating social cost stats. So I'm going to go through moving through concerns. I'll read some of the questions that seem to have triggered most of the conversation. And this will be comments. The first grouping we have concerns is that AI automation of this technology will have potential to capacity population. And this was a comment as well. Potential for disconnect market price, forecast, and market definition, assessment, unintended consequences, and allow flexibility for capacity. The next grouping of concerns is
any other topics, but like,
we want consistency, but at the same time we want flexibility. So those seem to be compatible both from like an utility and time. And then
if there's also questions about the
so
public
consistency versus flexibility. The next
yeah, any other
essentially
like
whatever comes out of this is the not doing like reality. So those are the concerns.
discussion, but I just want to make sure we get whatever is top of mind for you.
Some of the questions we got. So
What we're trying to do
how will the social cost of carbon be applied to
carbon
efficiency and response?
And take it into
Question was
we are
how
already
will customer generators be valued in the discussion over there?
If I take.
Yeah, absolutely.
How will it apply to all
It
of
was
us?
demonstration progress
How
for
is it going to
each
capture about benefits, costs, and risks? Whether we
Something
can
that John also offered was
That
just in
does
thinking of
not
the
actually
thinking of this topic,
help
think about
society.
our rules
If our objective function is to
So I thought this was really interesting. What is our objective function? So I'll leave
really
that.
want-
We don't have to remember what capturing
the ancillary value.
but the group, initial group said develop the model.
More of
Some
their
others
solar
were like, it's not.
right?
And then,
And that requires that I reserve a lot of
someone said we should engage
I'm
with
actually
utilities.
trying to do as much of that now.
So I'm gonna give you 4 stickies. If you have any concerns, questions, or comments, you can always capture.
The assets that I have,
No pressure to
we
add.
won't have that.
And then in the last 4 to
We'll not
5
have that
minutes,
as
we'll
a,
just discussion.
I'm trying to keep
Is everyone
on.
ready?
And it's
First of all,
I don't know exactly.
And while you're writing, I'll just read these out.
An increase in the actual.
Throwing a lot of information at you.
So I'm just gonna reflect on
And how are we talking about this question? So we're looking for concerns, questions, or comments. Comments have been mostly about, one of the biggest things across all of these is consistency versus flexibility. How do you resolve that? Unintended consequences generally capacity, planning, market price forecast, attribution. Another theme is how does this reflect reality? So I would say how are you actually incorporating
that we have this before planning requirement.
known costs, but things that are measurable, things that are unmeasurable, or have yet to be measured.
When you try to.
What is our objective? So those are the ones that I think. Comment, thank you.
Allowing whatever.
Okay, I'm gonna give everyone one more.
So ditto, yeah.
What he said.
Social
Oh,
benefits
no.
are in fact.
What'd you say?
So, my question, a lot of the utilities I work with are virtually, somewhere between 96, 97% to 99%. Because if you're really truly optimizing your economic. What is a clean energy action plan for someone who's like that? But also.
Straddle it, but
Someone who has.
so I'm just gonna do this. So I'm gonna start reading these if you're still writing that.
Still together. I'm gonna ask, because they're the first one to respond.
So I'm gonna hustle really fast on this. So new concerns are.
I mean,
as
you included, or how you
Very clearly.
scares me a little bit because
Talk
of
about
that
it.
consistency.
If you see me miss it, so
Economic efficiency.
I'm just gonna read them out. Clear implementation on geographic scope needs to be implemented. This is a mix between unintended consequences and consistent and so I'm gonna group. The other one was customer generators should be under competent under greenhouse gas offsets.
I'm saying that the problem
This is a new. This is a new.
less informed.
So the comments are that.
And I'm not, I don't think that's.
This actually needs more targeted conversation.
Able to have different
Different social costs of carbon be assessed with
That makes sense.
You know, in terms
This
of
is
how
not
to.
the last time we're gonna talk about this. Objective is to take carbon into account in resource decisions.
Next target,
But
next
model,
4 years must be a
should
higher
model
target.
reflect reality.
Actually achieve targets.
So
One
I
example
think, you
is
know, in terms
Individual
really
of-
interesting
utilities
working
should
on
use
industrial
those
demand
rules to
response,
make
but
the
we've had
model
2 projects in the last 2 months that quite excited about really fall through.
Implementation should reflect
Customer needs
operational
changing or
realities.
lack of desire.
And please, if
Rules should
you're-
encourage.
Not getting enough funding.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there are really
Social costs
So,
of carbon.
it's just depending on that targets need to not necessarily always be in one direction relative to other sets of targets.
You guys are responding to
What is a target?
So,
know about the
we have an objective.
What
What is our
megawatt hours
objective?
Is it the number of
This
customers?
issue needs more targeted conversations, I agree, 7 minutes. So thank you. Another one we got, so individual employees use as a resource. And so I think that ties into all of these concerns, which is
And for me, I think about it as like
unintended
a matrix model,
consequences.
starting from like a one.
Potentially avoided if they're
Yeah.
using their own resource mix.
Getting up 100%.
progress. We're trying to move towards seeing this, like, here's a holistic set of indicators that show this.
Clearly reality from this perspective, and I'm sorry.
And now we're making some kind of ordinary.
And
we're not there yet.
But
it is to measure carbon modeling or the statewide kind of process to measure. You know, we're trying to move from.
So I'm interested in a lot of talking together.
And that's
any
my
like
framework
burning
of how we
comments,
think about it.
questions,
So I don't
based on
disagree
all
that
the
there
words
could
I
be an
just
excellent
said.
model.
Go for it.
Clarity on
This is the right
impact and accountability. I think we still need clarity on impact and accountability because there's individual utility accountability, but
I'm thinking more
what is the
about
impact?
how
Because
we're effectively
we're really trying
demonstrating
to.
Accountability of the utility and
Yeah, and what is the real impact that we're trying to achieve by using this? Make sure that we're looking at it.
Then we want to
requirement or
that
legal
don't
Is it to account for
that might show up as
the
well.
non-energy benefits? Or is it, you know, there's other parts of the rule that maybe this ties to, are we double counting, or are we
Reallocation.
something, or
Not
are we
entirely
missing
sure
something
how
that's clear about this
transition
thing?
still organized. I don't know how much of this is
Really, I mean, it feels like
utilities is actually
focus on global greenhouse gas emissions is really reporting like that's the impact, and so far as boundary choices affect that, that's just the North Star.
buying more unspecified energy, or
We
would
don't
we
know
be
what
making
kind of
specified market?
I think one thing to consider though,
Does anybody want to?
given that renewables tend to be really coincidental.
Oh, it was kind of
So
similar to what
letting everybody
Eleanor
rely
said
on
in her
resource
first
mix
thing, which
has
is
a lot
how
of
are we
value
going to
in
ensure that the
individuals
utilities are
but
doing
realizing that not everybody can run their system
Yeah.
entirely
The fourth and final
without
rotation is about to
something
happen.
else to be able to balance.
One more minute.
Thank you guys. I know
Saving
there was
some
a
really
lot of,
pithy comments.
I
Last chance.
apologize if I'm going to talk about it more in this setting. I know we're probably, what I'm going to do based on your comments and questions, start coming together.
It's still
Yeah,
that.
talk about it. Thank you for your cooperation.
I swear I'm not running away from this conversation. I just have to have all the best ones, so yeah, y'all.
Paul, you may not follow.
And if you have questions or things, you write them on a note card or a sticky. Your input is always welcome, even if we've moved on. So. If you have things still that are lingering, feel free to write them on a sticky. Oh wait, Jay, right, you're over here. I don't know how high you think I can lift it. Thank you.
You were over there, never mind.
Yeah, you're right. No, you can put one up. You only have the one. The one down there. Okay, I hear really good. They asked me to give you a little recap. You have about 7 minutes in your last group, and then we'll have some report out and some additional conversation. Alright, hi guys. So what the topic is demonstration of progress.
What's the dog report incorporated?
Most discussed topic right here.
Okay. And also,
So that's sort of the best level that was to get us through, first IRP process, clean energy action plan, and allow us to iterate. Think about what's most important from it. You want
another one.
What are your biggest concerns that are
so
even
far
coming up?
is that
You say different areas.
we are worried about
Resource adequacy. Sorry, I'm hearing a lot of different ways.
At the same time, bring down the flexibility
I'll give you just a minute and then we'll have
within the utility
allow folks
to
flexibility
across all utilities.
That is such a
How
good
do you
question.
reconcile that? And then the last grouping of
One of the
concerns is
recommendations,
how will
so
this
section
reflect reality?
24,
We haven't defined
what I
reality.
have is,
We started doing that.
that makes a progress.
So,
Questions
that we've seen,
impacts are very minor change.
one was how are we going to value, how will this apply to
That's
not having hydro operating it
We're not including it today in terms of that specific integration, because the tool will be created by the end of the year. Myself is on working on that. Paul, was that you? What do you think? But there is a bigger question, right,
So,
about
we're at the
how to think about this
end.
tranche of,
Comments from all over the place. And so one that I kept seeing, so some comments were.
so kind of a lot of questions floating around.
So we saw some that said.
Any other things that pop up?
You go back and look at what
Front of mind,
if you took away an average
around what you've heard today.
what would that look like? How would your
Therefore.
Methodology standards. So if you want to think about, so for section 14, so page 1 of this packet, Commerce has kind of put together questions specifically about,
Well, I think the risk, it's a
does
different risk
define,
than having a plan.
resource
I think
what
the
kind of
recognition
resource,
that
term resource
depending on
how
how
you
you're defining that where you're thinking about facilities.
You're actually always just going to dive into
standards we could set
So,
up
you have to be really clear how it's going to be measured,
but there's kind of bigger questions around how to set those, that has permanently set those, what's the process, the utility potentially, so.
specific for your risk
What
may
needs
be
to be
different than
interested
80
to
year
hear that.
risk.
If
That in the
something,
law that
prioritize something in particular,
cost
the most
shifted
important.
to a certain customer class.
Thinking on to do the IRPs. What's got or that, or if there's things that you're confused about or concerned about, or
When setting the
any other
interim
things about the
targets for
process.
2030 to
How do you?
That-
So you have the 4-year resource.
Do you have any questions on me now? I'm the one
Then
who's
you have
starting.
the
I think a little bit of
Okay.
are supposed to start in their first IRP iteration that actually includes some of this stuff, so there's some clarity on how the social cost of carbon is going to be applied.
15 years
Things
out?
like that
Or are they
nature
more
is going to be really important. I think rather than having prescriptive recommendations at this phase, I think consistency is probably most important. Consistency between the utilities. And I'm.
So we want to start doing some comments. So something that I've been hearing a lot of was inconsistency versus desire for flexibility.
It would not be useful to have UTC prescribing certain things for the IRP.
What is our and then maybe touch on
Consistency at this
unessential platforms, but how do you make sure it captures reality and you're getting that utility from they should be empowered to use their
Demonstration of progress towards change. Right. And that's the question I have about this.
which then would
Was just with the
are
idea
not
of
exactly
conversation about rulemaking and what's in
The system is how do you keep
So I guess I think that maybe we could talk about aspirational versus mandates in other contexts that
It was our last week, that was a question I think we all touched on, the option touched on, what is going to be the outcome?
or the goals are you reach
Like,
by
see at a higher.
targets. And I understand that if you said things that get there anyway, they're not
help us as we develop.
we need to be aspirational.
that was something that somebody was brought up, was just like, what is diversity to be, like, clearly defining like what's domestic, especially for
So I think it's kind of interesting, because we know there will be some difference between.
and also that we should be more clarified in the rules, or
as compared to.
should it come like a wait and see what happens, or adding it later? That was
When I wrote about that,
At least in the early
We're not
days,
really
have
talking
the
about
known
how close you
blooming
are.
capacity need in our.
Yep.
Yeah.
this venue.
I apologize
That
for
would seem
putting
the
some
best
up
possible.
There's no hope at this point.
So if this is.
We already decided to have.
Okay, well, if this is something you've already decided.
I agree, once there's a
talk about down the road.
kind of collaborative approach to resource
One of the things we feel
adequacy.
really strongly about is that
That you reflected
the
back.
application of cost of greenhouse gases to the utility.
Oh, we are too. So, you know, I just like demonstration.
I
We're doing this
concur,
process.
I concur, and there is, so actually, can we write that down?
This is kind of interesting
Um,
because, you know, nobody plans
John, what
to
you got?
be
Subsidizing dirty utility regional
because
greenhouse
we're part of a
gas
bigger
capture.
challenge. So
Lies
we
of
are,
conservation.
right now, assuming our neighbors are gonna do something
He
too.
captured it. He just put
But if we,
two marks there.
offensive, it's like reserve sharing, why do we do reserve sharing? So if all of a sudden your plan, you know, your plan maybe has some diversity factor, because it just would be really expensive, right? Everybody has this plan, there is absolutely isolation. So you have this unintended
whether that's a need issue or just how long it's
potentially
going to
all of a
take,
sudden
I guess,
everybody's
can be debated.
failing.
But then there's
You might be
also
dragged
this
down
that
because your risk is still associated with
has
how
much more of
everybody's
Capture what we heard.
right. I think it should be discussed like
The flip side
market
of that is where,
and in my mind that works for saying
so if everybody
and every day overbuild.
everyone else who's watching this.
And
this
we're
is
all
what
there.
we're
Yeah.
This is what
Everybody overbuild.
no.
There's two transmission, and I appreciate that distinction.
System,
You also point out
staff,
there's kind of the brass tacks,
we have
like
subject
what are
matter
the numbers,
experts.
what are the hardware, and then there's the
They're
steps around it.
accountable, but that's how you, but that's where you compete to
What are our
over
market
building, which can cost them.
Prescriptive versus
Where are we going to have
We
the
didn't force you to
market?
open resource adequacy.
Yeah,
There's one utility's gonna bear the brunt.
Oh, we're also trying to like in another like this, just like now different ways. You can make things lines like getting to the plants what that means. You can also figure out that you might have on versus that too. Definitely into the charges. There's like things like what does that look like?
Well, to that point, distributed generation would fit in well in this.
Interesting that
It
that
provides you
way.
a way to build without building. You're letting someone else do the building. Risk of overbuilding.
So when I think the outcome or at least a deliverable from those interactions that needs to be
Involved in this law.
So as a way for other inputs, coming from like the low carbon grid study that we started to see what the real capacity would be in the region, I guess. It would require a different outlook than we've taken on it thus far. And how we're taking these data points and deciding as participants in whatever venue is appropriate, how to address those in a feasible way.
That's more applicable to wind than it is.
All right, you guys, everybody can stay where they are. Thank you, everyone. We know that this was not a lot of time to have the kinds of conversations that you need to have, but it was a great place to start. What we're going to do now is we are going to have our commerce team, the subject matter expert and the facilitator and the recorder, do a quick report out of some of the things they heard, the themes that they heard, and then we'll have the rest of the time to engage in a conversation that Dr. Glenn Blackman will, and Rachel and I will help facilitate. So with that, which one of our teams would like to report out first? Mike. Oh, Sarah. Yeah.
Sarah's doing it.
And then we'll just go around the room to J. Ray, Michael, and then Emily.
Right, so the one that I was facilitating talked about methodologies and standards. So this is kind of this overarching question of, how are we going to think about creating a methodologies and standards that allow us to be both flexible moving forward, but also accountable to the work that we need to do in the planning process. So kind of just that dynamic tension about, those questions. And so some of the things that came up was, what ways can we be accountable? Does it have to be through rulemaking? Are there other ways to do it? And how does this process align with other efforts in the state? So the power pool work and some other regional efforts, where do those fit in and kind of who's leading whom on that? And then questions about, definitions around mandated rules versus voluntary rules, and ones that, and then sort of this idea that, are we thinking about utilities as entities in and of themselves?
And how do you think about that then with the whole system? So metrics and methodologies that, are there different methods and standards that, a utility would use to think about its own progress? And then is there a different one that you do to think about the whole system, especially with something around like transmission or resource adequacy? Anything else? There's a lot of questions about transparency and visibility, which are kind of two different things, and we haven't said them differently, but we're implicating new entities in terms of people that are the holders of data and analysis. So thinking about something like transmission, how do we bring those folks in, and how do we use data that maybe like we don't own, the utilities don't own, like what's the venue to actually like do that work? So some of the work groups were brought up, the transmission work group. As well as the markets group. So with the transmission group maybe doing a little bit more of the nitty gritty, and then the markets group having this broader conversation about this kind of these regional efforts.
Social and economic.
Yes, and then lots of questions about the kind of how to incorporate the public interest aspects is how we're going today, and the social and economic analysis. So, admitting that we're sort of on the bleeding edge of some of that analysis, that it's, we're really leading on that conversation. And so, how to, again, in that particular conversation, it's even more so, to establish a baseline enough to get us moving forward and understand progress, but that flexibility to develop something that will be a robust methodology for the state moving forward. Hopefully I captured, there's a lot more, and obviously we'll be summarizing these and making these notes available. So, I will cede my time to the next person.
It should be me.
Yes,
I am
we'll
no
be
subject
here.
matter expert, but I can read my own writing better than anyone in this room probably could. But our topic was demonstration of progress towards GHG
Jessica,
neutral.
right, can you speak up a little? Sorry.
Try. I'm trying to let people see. And because I got to read it too. Demonstration of progress towards GHG neutral and 100% standards. Some of the main themes that we had are questions coming out of this was what is going to happen for nearly 100% clean utilities? What will be required to meet the standards? What does demonstration mean? Like a clarification around like what does demonstration look like who's demonstrating that and what does that mean in the bigger picture? How do you determine what is cost effective? Should it be in the rule now, sooner than later, or wait and see? So ideas of what that standard should be, and like should it be in the rules now, should it be really specific, or is this a process where we need to wait and see and like kind of see what happens and add it as we go? As we're demonstrating progress, how do we address unintended consequences? Like, are there any off-ramps? So if things happen and they come up along the way and we're doing this rulemaking, like, is there a system in place to address those, the unknowns that come up, the variables? Let's see. Like, is there a feedback mechanism? Is that missing? Should it be there? What does that look like? If a county has massive growth, how do we handle this? Make adjustments? And then we went to some charts, which I thought this was great because it says which of these compliance plans is the question, but a member drew like 4 different compliance plans, and this brought up the idea of equity and how you charge people for certain things, and like charging people up front and what that looks like as far as equity goes, or if it's along the way. And when you're going towards a goal and demonstrating something that looks pretty consistent straight up, like you want progress the whole way, but what happens if this happens this way? So there's a lot of conversation around that. Someone shared that there was an intention when it was drafted to kind of answer one of the back questions, an interest in being sure that the utilities couldn't sell and slide backwards. So what does the public-facing aspect look like? Like what kind of information should be available to the public? Because it's not going to be a bunch of people who are subject matter experts or even people that do this on a daily basis. So it's going to be a matter of them being able to have information in their bills, and is that something that the utilities roll out and they send something to their consumers so they understand how they're reaching those goals, and how do you do it in a way that the consumers or an average person would be able to understand what that means, like what that looks like and get involved. So a lot of conversation was around compliance language, like there being a disconnect, like the ability to accurately tell a story because there's different measures of different energies and like people using them in a certain space and how that could fulfill its lifetime. And so what does that look like when you're measuring certain things? Like what does progress look like? So something may look like progress to a group of people that are
using the energy, and something may look like progress differently to another group. So how do you measure that, and how do you figure that out? Demonstration of progress, a lot of it had to do with just the progress and like what that looks like. How are you clear on that? How do you measure that? How do you share that information with different groups of people? So the demonstration of progress to align with variabilities regarding different varied hydro yearly. So how to measure something if you have like a really good hydro year and then you have not so good hydro year, like what does that look like over 4 years? What does that look like over 40 years? And how just more clarity on how to measure that, how to measure those things. I wrote down aspiration versus mandate. How close are you to meeting your plan? So like, are our plans being written and are people utilizing the tools in front of them as like an aspiration, like we want to get to this place? Or is there like a mandate, like by this date, if I'm not saying this properly, is there a mandate to get to a certain place by one date or not? I think that's all I got.
Michael,
Is there anything I missed? Okay.
So I was responsible for methodology for incorporating.
What, Michael? Sorry, British.
Okay, sorry. I was responsible for the methodology for incorporating social costs of greenhouse gas. Shout out to this room. I know you guys wanted to do a lot more, and there just wasn't enough time, but I think we got some really good results. So I'm going to read out by grouping of concern, question, and then potential responsive comments. So the first one group of concern was the application of this methodology may have unintended consequences, and some of those consequences include capacity planning, resource adequacy, transmission levels, market price forecasts, market depth. And then another concern was, and I think this was a very clear theme, was while we're worried about inconsistent application of this methodology, so how do maybe we need to be prescriptive about it, but if you're prescriptive, you're not flexible, and we need flexibility both within the utility over iterations of these planning, so over time, and we also might need flexibility amongst utilities that are subject to CETA. And then another grouping of concerns was, how does this methodology reflect reality? And we didn't even begin to define what reality was. And then another grouping of concerns was, questions was, how will the social cost of carbon be applied to various resource types, both demand and supply? And then in response was, well, are you going to capture the value of customer generators like distributed solar, or will you capture their offsets? Essentially, are you going to capture their full value? And we heard this earlier about the methodology that captures known and maybe unknown, measurable and unmeasurable benefits, risks, and costs. So one responsive question to the concern about inconsistency versus prescriptiveness versus flexibility is, does Commerce have a tool available that is softer than a rulemaking but is enforceable in some way? Another question that we had, which is really good, which is, what is the objective function of developing this methodology? Is it simply to design a model that has known defined inputs and outputs, or is it something that's much broader, such as thinking beyond just what the model might capture? How do you deal with, is the objective function capturing global greenhouse gas emissions, generally taking carbon into account? And then some of the responsive comments later in the group about this methodology needs to capture or reflect reality is, well, maybe we need to have the utilities know their system best, they know their customers best, so the methodology needs to be based on the utility's own resource, dispatch modeling, its own operational characteristics, etc. And then one of the last comments, concerns we got regarding this methodology is, how do we avoid unfair cost sharing, but not only between customer classes, but also across utilities in the region, those who have cleaner resource mixes versus those that have dirtier resource mixes.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Last one, couple minutes.
Melissa and I had Clean Energy Action Plan and interim targets, which was a blended topic. The best way I can distill the conversation is what plan, when does it need to happen, what should it contain, and how do the plans all connect? There was a lot of discussion about the Clean Energy Action Plan, the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, and the IRP process. So how do they sequence and inform each other? We talked about flexibility and consistency, but being consistent with the flexibility. So an example that came up was the targets. Do we want to set them as ranges? Do we want to have the option to have trade-offs with those targets depending on real world and how it plays out? And then the last thing to offer is the observation about investor-owned utilities and the consumer-owned in their existing fuel mix right now and the starting point that they're doing that planning from.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it, thank you all very much for participating in this and being willing to have short bursts of conversation. There are stickies and notepads and Sharpies and email. The conversation doesn't need to stop right here. I'm going to turn it over to Glenn, and we can have the next 15 minutes or so to have some conversation and some closure. So on that, Glenn?
Yeah, we can wrap this whole set of topics up.
Yeah, we're done.
Okay, maybe not. I do first want to thank the small group facilitators. Because of the this priority setting process, they didn't know ahead of time what they were going to be, which topic they were going to be covering, and if I had been doing it, I'm not sure I would know even now which topic I was covering, because some of them were pretty broad, and I really appreciate their willingness to step into that role and provide facilitation for your comments. And of course, I appreciate your comments too, and like Rebecca said, your willingness to do what sometimes feels pretty frustrating to, you just get going and then you lose your facilitator. But anyway, as far as the future with these topics, one thing I want to just kind of set with you guys in terms of expectations is that this is a set of issues that we intend to carry with us over quite a while. We're not going to try to sit down and write planning rules right away. We identified this as an area that was important and that was a priority, and it remains that way, but it seems pretty clear to us that it's really hard to separate these from some of the compliance and reporting issues, in particular the part about compliance, and if you don't know what is required for compliance, then maybe you aren't going to get your plan done right. And so we will invite your comments on what you've heard and learned so far on this. I'm going to send out something that encourages you to send in written comments on these topics by the end of October. And in the meantime, we're going to switch subjects in terms of the workshops. And the October workshop in Wenatchee, we're going to focus on the reporting and compliance obligations, kind of a little bit more nitty-gritty stuff about, what does a report look like and what day should it be submitted, and some issues like that that in some cases will mean maybe a different set of people within your organization will have an interest in that. And so then the second thing I'm going to ask for is ahead of that workshop, which I think is October 21st, I'm going to invite kind of written comments about topics or proposals that people might have, depending on where you are in your thought process. You might have a specific proposal that you want us to consider in the areas of implementation, of compliance and reporting, or you may just want to say, I think we need to discuss a certain topic. But either way, I'm going to ask for some written comments to help us build the agenda for that October meeting. And then finally, going back to the world where we are actually looking at rule language, thank you to those of you who sent in comments on the EIA and social cost of carbon drafts. We plan next week to get something out to you in response to those new version of language. I feel like we are on track to wrap that part up with actual adopted rules by the end of this calendar year. And so you can look for something from us to move that part of the process along. Sarah, you've got a...
Yeah, and then to continue kind of the conversation about low income and equity issues in CETA, there will be a second meeting for the low income and equity work group on November 4th. So any day now you will get a save the date in your inboxes. It should be coming out soon. So that'll be November 4th, 9 to noon at the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. That will give an opportunity to hear from some programmatic folks, so utilities and other direct services folks that can give us a programmatic view of energy assistance programs, so it'll be kind of a deeper dive into Section 12. And as Glenn says, this may be someone else in your agency, but just to let them know. A chance to think about data and resources around how to do some of that planning work that's in there, and some of the assessment for utilities about how to meet goals. So bringing in the folks from DOH to talk about cumulative impact analysis. But then also, kind of some of the stuff that's been touched on here, right? Like, what are the actual tools we're going to use as a state to make decisions in planning about this work with respect to low income and equity issues. And then a workshop to help generate ideas and prioritize what needs to be in a set of guidelines that will come out to help show how to be compliant with Section 12. So, those will be available by January 2020. But with a lot of opportunity for public input and stakeholder work. So that workshop will be that opportunity to do some work in the room and figure out what needs to be in there so that everyone knows where we're at and what we need to do. So if you have any questions, shoot us an email about either thing at the ceta@commerce.wa.gov email address.
Yeah. One other point on the kind of the exchange of information is if you want more quality time with us, set up a meeting and, invite us to come to your place or whatever, and give us your full, explication on a particular topic like that. We can sit down with you and we won't tell you to be quiet after 7 minutes.
But maybe after 10. I was going to say maybe.
So anyway, it doesn't always have to be here. We're happy to come and see you. So we got a little bit of time left. Anybody want to offer up any thoughts about the issues, the process, how you feeling, what you want for lunch? Ian.
I just had a kind of a process question. For the comments that are due at the end of October to talk about the issues we discussed today, what level of granularity is going to be most useful for Commerce? If we have like a full greenhouse gas, social cost of carbon application methodology ready to go, is that something you want, or would you think more higher level principles would be more useful?
And you're bluffing, right? You don't actually.
We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, let's just see. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I do feel like we would benefit a lot from suggestions about approaches, like, that we think a greenhouse gas methodology that does it in this way would be consistent with the statute. It should be in the rule. Then, and without getting into each cell and all the formulas, we're happy to hear those more conceptual things. We'll continue to become more granular as we move along, I think. Yeah.
So with regard to some of the
new requirements for entities who have 2020 IRPs. It seems like there's a lot of things here that still remain to be decided. Do we have a timeline of what a definitive set of assumptions could, should, would look like for entities to begin developing 2020 IRPs?
I definitely appreciate the concern about that the deadlines, don't stop. Elisa, do you want to talk for a second about how Seattle City Light's approaching that?
I mean, I think generally we're just trying to look through the law and apply it as closely as we can without it being prescriptive. We want to identify how we followed the rule, and we want to identify, maybe as things come along and we haven't maybe followed exactly the way the rule says later, at least we can identify where we are different and why, because we've already moved on from that, and you can't just redo an IRP at the end. So I think it's just try to create transparency about how we complied and how we prepare our IRP for 2020
Yeah.
IRP.
I mean, I don't see us getting to having rules early in 2020, so we're just going to have to proceed in good faith.
Follow up on that. So if we're filing by September 2020, then it's going to be our best effort. Is what I'm hearing.
Does anybody have other thoughts on that? I mean, any of the environmental advocates have a different view about that? Yeah, seems like that makes sense. Do your best and do justice, we move forward. All right, class dismissed. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
On the west side?
All right.
Thank you for being
Yeah, hi, Rob. So we're going to the fish tail.
If you want a piece of
I can't eat. I'm just going to start. I eliminated it because I have culture of celiac. It goes away when I don't have food. I think I have Thank you.
And then I'm leaving, so I'm only good to answer questions for the next few minutes.